Hello everyone. This video our group gonna make one audiobook and the title of the book is The Pill by John SteinBeck. In the town they tell the story of the great pill, how it was found and how it was lost again. They tell of Kino the fisherman and of his wife, Juna and of the baby Coyotino. And because the story has been told so often, it has taken root in every man's mind. And as with all retold tales that are in people's heart, there are only good and bad things, black and white things, good and evil things, and no in between anywhere. If this story is parable, perhaps everyone takes his own meaning from it and reads his own life into it. In any case, they say in the town that Kino awake in the near dark. The stars still shone and the day had thrown only a power of light in the lower sky to the east. The roosters had been crowing for some time, and the early pigs were already beginning their ceaseless turning of twig and bit of wood to see whether anything to eat had been overlooked. Outside the brass house in the tuna clump, a covey of little birds chittered and fluttered with their wings. Kino's eyes opened and he looked first at the light square which was the door, and then he looked at the hanging box where Coyotito slept. At last he turned his head to Juana, his wife, who lay beside him on the mat, her blue hair shawl over her nose and over her breast and around the small of her back. Juna's eyes were open too. Kino could never remember seeing them closed when he awake. Her dark eyes met little reflex stars. She was looking at him as she was always looking at him when he awake. Kino heard the little splash of morning bell on the beach. It was very good. Kino closed his eyes again to listen to his music. Perhaps he alone did this, and perhaps all of his people did it. His people had once been great makers of songs, so that everything they saw or thought or did or heard became a song. That was very long ago. The song remained. Kino knew them, but no new songs were added. That does not mean that there were no personal songs. In Kino's head there was a song now, clear and soft, and if he had been able to speak of it, he would have called it the song of the family. A blanket was over his nose to protect him from the dark air. His eye flicked through a rascal beside him. It was Joanna arising almost soundlessly. On her hand bare feet she went to the hanging box where Coyotito slept, and she leaned over and said a little reassuring word. Coyotito looked up for a moment and closed his eyes and slept again. Joanna ran to the fire pit and uncovered a coil and fanned it alive while she broke little pieces of bark over it. Now Kino got up and wrapped his blanket about his head and nose and shoulder. He slipped his feet into his sandal and went outside toward the dawn. Outside the door he squatted down and gathered the blanket and about his knee. He saw the speck of gold cloud flame high in the air, and a goat came near and sniffed at him and stared with its cold yellow eye. Be- Behind him, Juana fire leaped into flame and threw a spear of light through the cheek of the brass half wall and threw a whirring square of light out the door. A late moth blasted it to find the fire. The song of the family came now from behind Kino. And the rhythm of the family song was the grinding stone, where Joanna worked the corn for the morning cake. The dawn came quickly now, a wash, a glow, a light, and then an explosion of fire as the sun rose out of the gulf. Kino looked down to cover his eyes from the glare. He could hear the part of the corn cakes in the house, and the rich smell of them on the cooking plate. The ants were busy on the ground, big black one with shiny body and little dusty quick arm. Kino watched with a detachment of guard while a dusty arm frantically tried to escape the sand trap an ant-lion had dug for him. A thin, timid dog came close and, at a soft word from Kino, curled up around its tail nearly over its feet, and landed its chin delicately on the pillow. It was a black dog with yellow ghost spots where its eyebrows should have been. It was a morning like other morning, and yet perfect among morning. Kino heard the crack of the rope when Joanna took Coyotito out of his hanging box and cleaned him and hammocked him in her shawl in a loop that placed him close to her breast. Kino could see the thing without looking at them. Joanna sang softly an ancient song that had only three notes and yet only variety of interval. And this was part of the family song too. It was all part. Something it rose to an ancient chord and that catch the throat saying this is safety, this is warm, this is the whole. Across the bathroom were other brass house, and the smoke came from them too, and the sound of the breakfast. But those were other songs. Their pig were other pig. Their wife were not Joanna. Kino was young and strong, and his black hair hung over his brown forehead. His eyes were warm and bright, and his mustache was thin. He lowered his blanket from his nose now, for the dark portion of air was gone and the yellow sunlight fell on the house. Near the bathroom, two roosters bowed and flaunted at each other with squat wing and neck feathers rushed out. It would be a clumsy fight. They were not game chicken. Kino watched them for a moment, and then his eye ran up to a flight of wild doe twinkling inland to the hill. The world was awake now, and Kino arose and went into his brass house. As he came through the house, Joanna stood up from the glowing fire's pit. She put Coyotito back in his hanging box, and then she combed her black hair and braided it into braids and tied the end with thin green ribbon. Kino squatted by the fire pit and rolled a hot corn cake and dipped it in sauce and ate it, and he drank a little pakru, and that was breakfast. That was the only breakfast he had ever known outside of fifth day, and one incredible freestyle cookie that had nearly killed him. When Kino had finished, Joanna came back to the fire and ate her breakfast. They had spoken once, but there is no need for speak, if it is only a habit anyway. Kino sighed with satisfaction, and that was conversation. The sun was warming, the brass house breaking through its clear in long streaks, and one of the streaks fell on the hanging box where Coyotito lay and on the rope that held it. It was a tiny movement and drew their eye to the hanging box. Kino and Joanna froze in their position. Down the rope that hung the baby box from the roof support a scorpion moved slowly. His stinking tail was straight out behind him, but he could whip it up in a flash of time. Kino breathed whistle in his nostril and he opened his mouth to stop it. And then the startled look was gone from his and the rigidity from his body. In his mind a new song had come, the song of evil, the music of the enemy, of any foe of the family, a savage, secret, dangerous melody, and underneath the song of the family cried plaintively. The scorpion moved delicately down the rope toward the box. Under her breath, Joanna repeated an ancient magic to guard against such evil, and on top of that she muttered a Hail Mary between clenched teeth. But Kino was in motion. His body clicked quickly across the room, noiselessly and smoothly. His hands were in front of him, palm down, and his eyes were on the scorpion. Beneath it in the hanging box, Coyotito laughed and reached up his hand toward it. It sensed danger when Kino was almost within reach of it. It stopped and its tail rose up over its back in a little jerk, and the curl thrown on the tail and clinched it. Kino stood perfectly still. He could hear Juana whispering the old magic again, and he could hear the evil music of the enemy. He could not move until the scorpion moved, and it fell for the shaft of the death that was coming to it. Kino's hand went forward very slowly, very smoothly. The thorn tail jerked upright, and at that moment the laughing coyotito shocked the rock and the scorpion fell. Kino's hand leaped to catch it, but it fell past his finger, fell on the baby's shoulder, landed and struck. Had the baby in her arm now. She found the punster with redness starting from it already. She put her lip down over the punster and shook hard and sparked and shook again while Coyotito screamed. Kino hurried. He was helpless. He was in the way. The scream of the baby brought the neighbor out of the brush house they pure. Kino's brother June, Thomas, and his fat wife Apollonia and their four children crowded in the door and blocked the entrance, while behind them others tried to look in, and one small boy crawled among legs to have a look, and those in front passed the word back to those behind. Scorpion, the baby has been stung. Joanna stopped suckling the plaster for a moment. The little hole was slightly enlarged, and it brightened from the suckling. But the red swelling turned farther around it in a hard lymphatic mold, and all of these people knew about the scorpion and Adele might be very ill from the sting, but the baby could easily die from the poison. First, they knew would come swelling and fever and turning through, and then cramp in the stomach, and then Coyotito might die if it not all the poison had gone in. But the stinging pain of the bit was going away. Coyotito's scream turned to moan. Then, snarling, Kino had it in his fingers, rubbing it to a paste in his hand. He threw it down and beat it into the earth floor with his feet, and Coyotito screamed with pain in his bark. But Kino bit and stamped the enemy until it was only a fragment and a moist place in the dirt. His teeth were belly and furry flare in his eye, and the songs and the enemy roared in his ear. But Juana Kino had wondered often at the iron in his patient, fragile wife. She, who was obedient and respectful and cheerful and patient, she could arch her back in childpain with hardly a cry. She could stand frantic and hunger almost better than Kino himself. In the kennel she was like a strong man, and now she did a most surprising thing. "The doctor," she said. "Go to get the doctor." The word was passed out among the neighbors, where they stood close packed in the little yard behind the brass fan, and they repeated among themselves, "Juana want the doctor." A wonderful thing, a memorable thing to want a doctor. To get him would be a remarkable thing. The doctor never came to the cluster of brass house. Why should he, when he had more than he could do to take care of the rich people who live in the stone and plaster house of the town? He would not come, the people in the yard said. He would not come, the people in the door said. And the thought got into Kino. The doctor would not come, Kino said to Joanna. She looked up at him, her eye as cool as the eye of a lion. This was Juana's first baby. This was nearly everything there was in Juana's world, and Kino saw her that determination and the music of the family sound in his head in a steely tone. "Then we will go to him," Joanna said, and with one hand she arranged her dark blue shawl over her head and made off one end of it a sling to hold a morning baby, and made of the under end of it set over his eyes to protect him from the light. The people in the door pushed against those behind to let her through. Kino followed her. They went out of the gate to the ratty path, and the neighbor followed them. The thing had become a neighborhood affair. They made a quick south-foot procession into the center of the town. First Joanna and Kino, and behind them June Thomas and Apollonia, her big stomach jiggling with their sterner past. Then other neighbor with the children trotting on the flag, and the yellow fan threw their black shadow ahead of them so that they walked on their own shadow. They came to the place where the brass house stopped and the city of stone and plaster began. The city of hearts outer wall and inner cold garden where a little water play and the bougainvillea crossed the wall with purple and brick red and white. They heard from the secret garden the singing of gay birds and heard the splash of cooling water on hot flagstone. The procession crossed the blinding plaza and passed in front of the church. It had grown now, and on the outskirts the hurrying newcomers were being softly informed how the baby had been stung by a scorpion, how the father and mother were taken into the doctor, and the newcomer, particularly the beggar from the front of the church who were great experts in financial analysis, looked quickly at Joanna. Old Blueskirt saw the tea in her throat, appraised the green ribbon on her breast, read the age of Kino blanket and the thousand washing off his clothes, and set them as poverty people and went along to see what kind of drama might develop. The four began for us. The church knew everything in the town. They were students of the expression of young women as they went into confession, and they saw them as they came out and read the nature of the scene. They knew every little schedule, some be very big crime. They slept at their posts in the shadow of the church, so that no one crept in for consolation without their knowledge. And they knew the doctor. They knew his ignorance, his crudely, his arrogance, his appetite, his sin. They knew his clumsy abortion and the little brown penny he gave sparingly for them. They had seen his corporal go into the church, and since early mass was over, business was slow. They followed the procession, this endless social after perfect knowledge of their fellow men, to see what the fat lazy doctor would do about an indigent baby with a scorpion bit. The scouring procession came at last to the big gate in the wall of the doctor house. They could hear the splashing water and the singing of birds and the sweep of the long broom on the flagstone, and they could smell the frying of good bacon from the doctor house. Kino hesitated a moment. This doctor was not of his people. This doctor was of a race which for nearly 400 years had beaten and starved and robbed and despised Kino's race, and frightened it too, so that the indigent came humbly to the door, and as always when he came near to one of his race, Kino felt weak and afraid and angry at the same time. Rag and terror went together. He could kill the doctor more easily than he could talk to him. For all the doctor rest spoke to all the of Aquino rest thought they were simple animals, and as Kino raised his right hand to the iron ring knocker in the gate, Rex well in him, and the prodding music of the enemy beat in his ear, and his lip drew tight against his teeth, but his left hand he reached to take off his hat. The iron ring pounded against the gate. Kino took off his hat and stood waiting. Coyotito moaned a little in Juana's arm and he spoke softly to him. The procession crowded close together to see and hear. After the moment the began opened a few inches, Kino could see the green coolness of the garden, and little splashing fountain through the opening. The man who looked out at him was one of his own race. Kino spoke to him in the own language. The little one, the firstborn, has been poisoned by the scorpion. Kino said he required the skill of the healer. The gate closed a little, and the servant refused to speak in the own language. A little moment, he said, I go to inform myself. And he closed the gate and slid the boat home. The clearing sun threw the black shadow of the people blackly on the Bible. In his chamber, the doctor sat up in his high bed. He had on his dressing gown of red waterside that had come from Paris, a little tired over the chest now if it was buttoned. On his lap was a silver tray with a silver chocolate pot and a tiny cup of eggshell china, so delicate that it looked silly when he lifted it with his big hand. Lift it with the tip of thumb and forefinger and spread the other three fingers wide to get them out of the way. His eye rested in perfectly little hammocks of flesh and his mouth dropped with discontent. He was growing very stout, and his voice was harsh with the fat that pressed on his throat. Beside him on the table was a small orange gong and a boy of cigarette. The furnishing of the room were heavy and dark and gloomy. The pictures were religious, even the large thin photographs of his dead wife, who is Marfil and paid for out of her own estate could do it, was in heaven. The doctor had once for a short time been a part of the great world, and his whole subsequent life was memory and longing for friends. That, he said, was civilized living, by which he meant that on a small income he had been able to keep a mistress and eat in restaurants. He poured his second cup of chocolate and crumbled a sweet biscuit in his finger. The servant from the gate came to the open door and stood waiting to be noticed. Yes, the doctor asked. It is a little Indian with a baby, he said. A scorpion stuck it. The doctor put his cup down gently before he let his anger rise. Have I nothing better to do than cure insect bit for little Indian? Am a doctor, not veterinary? Yes, patron, said the servant. Had he any money? The doctor demanded. No, they never has any money. I alone in the world am supposed to work for nothing. And I am tired of it. See if he has any money. At the gate, the servant opened the door a trifle and looked out at the waiting people, and this time he spoke in the old language. Have you money to pay for the treatment? Now Kino reached into a cigarette placed somewhere under his blanket. He brought out a paper folded many times. Grease by grease he unfolded it, until at last there came to view a small misshapen simple as ugly and grey as little, flatted and almost valueless. The servant took the paper and closed the gate again, but this time he was not gone long. He opened the gate just far enough to pass the paper back. The doctor has gone out, he said. He was called to a serious case, and he shut the gate quickly out of shame. And now a wave of shame went over the whole procession. The male away, the beggar went back to the church step, and the straggler moved off, and the neighbor departed, so that the public shaming of Kino would not be in their eyes. For a long time Kino stood in front of the gate with Juana beside him. Slowly he put his pliant hat on his head. Then, without warning, he struck the gate a crushing blow with his fist. He looked down in wonder at his split knock and at the blood that flowed down between his fingers. The town lay on a broad estuary, its own yellow clustered building hushing the beach. And on the beach, the white and blue canoe that came from Nayari were thrown up. Canoe preserved for generations by a hard shell like waterproof plaster, whose making was a secret of the fishing people. They were high and graceful canoe with curved bow and stern and a breast section midship where a mast could be stepped to carry a small Latin sail. The beach was yellow sand, but at the water edge a ripple of sand and art took in its place. Fiddler crab bubbled and sputtered in the hole in the sand, and in the shallow little lobster popped in and out of their tiny home in the rubble and sand. The sea bottom was rich with crawling and swimming and growing things. The brown algae well in the general current, and the green sailgrass swayed and little seahorse clung to its stem. Spot protected the poison fish lay on the bottom in the eelgrass bed, and the bright-colored swimming crabs swam over them. On the beach, the hungry dog and the hungry pigs of the town searched endlessly for any dead fish or seabird that might have floated in on a rising tide. Although the morning was young, the hazy mirage was up. The uncertain air that magnified something and blotted out the how hung over the whole gulf so that all signs were unreal, and vision could not be trusted. So the sea and land had the sharp clarity and the vagueness of the dream. Thus it might be that the people of the gulf trust think of the spirit and think of the imagination, but they do not trust their eye to show them distant or clear outline of any optical extract. Across the estuary from the town, one section of microwave stone, clear and telescopically defined, while another manicured column was a hazy black-green blob. Part of the far shore disappeared into a shimmer that looked like water. There was no certainty in seeing, no proof that what you saw was there or was not there. And the people of the Gulf expect all places were that way, and it was not stranger to them. A copper hat hung over the water, and the hot morning sun beat on it and made it vibrate blindingly. The bright houses of the fishing people were back from the beach on the right-hand side of the town, and the canoes were drawn up in front of this area. Kino and Joanna came slowly down to the beach and to Kino's canoe, which was the one thing of value he owned in the world. It was very old. Kino's grandfather had brought it from Nayari, and he had given it to Kino's father, and so it had come to Kino. It was that one property and a source of food for a man with a boat can guarantee a woman that she will eat something. It is the bulwark against starvation, and every year Kino refinished his canoe with a hard shell like plaster by secret method that had also come to him from his father. Now he came to the canoe and touched the bow tenderly, as he always did. He laid his diving rod and his basket and two ropes in the sand by canoe, and he folded his blanket and lay it in the bow. Joanna lay Coyotito on the blanket, and she placed her shawl over him so that the hot sun could not shine on him. He was quiet now, but the swelling on his shoulder had continued up his neck and under his ear, and his face was pushed and very rich. Joanna went to the water and waded in. She gathered some brown seaweed and made a flat dam poulticed it, and this he applied to the baby's swollen shoulder, which was as good a remedy as any, and probably better than the doctor could have done. But Remanley lacked his authority because it was simple and didn't cost anything. The stomach crab had not come to Coyotito. Perhaps Juana had sucked out the poison in time, but she had not sucked out her worry over her firstborn. She had not prayed directly for the recovery of the baby. She had prayed that they might find a pill with which to hire the doctor to cure the baby, for the mind of people as unsubstantial as the miracle of the Gulf. Now, Kino and Juana slid the canoe down the beach toward the water, and when the boat floated, Juana climbed in, while Kino pushed the stern in and right beside it, until it floated lightly and trembled on the little breaking well. Then, in coordination, Juana and Kino threw the double-black paddle into the sea, and the canoe cruised the water and his with speed. The pillars were gone out long. Seen in a few moments, Kino could see them clustered in the house riding over the oyster bed. Life filtered down through the water to the bed where the freshly peeled oyster lay fastened to the rubbly bottom. A bottom strewed with shell of broken open oyster. It was the bed that had raised the King of Spain to be a great power in Europe in past year, had had to pay for his fur, and had decorated the church for his own sake. The grey oyster with ruffle-like skirt on the shell, the barnacle grass oyster with little bit of wheat clinging to the skirt, and small crab climbing over them. An accident could happen to this oyster. A grain of sand lie in the fold of mussel and irritate the flesh until it, in self-protection, in the flesh coat the grain with a layer of smooth cement. But once started, the flesh continued to coat the foreign body until it fell free in some tidal flurry, or until the oyster was destroyed. For centuries, men had died down and torn the oyster from the bed and ripped them open, looking for the coated grain of sand. Swarm of fish lived near the bed, to live near the oyster, thrown back by the searching man, and to nibble at the shining inner shell. But the pill were accident, and the finding of one was luck. A little pat on the back by God, or the god of a bull. Kino has two ropes, one tied to a heavy stone and one to a basket. He stripped off his skirt and trousers and laid his head in the bottom of the canoe. The water was oily smooth. He took his rock in one hand and his basket in the other hand, and he slipped feet first over the side, and the rock carried him to the bottom. The bubble rose behind him until the water cleared and he could see. Above the surface of the water was an undulating mirror of brightness, and he could see the bottom of the canoe sticking through it. Kino moved cautiously so that the water would not be obscured with mud or sand. He hooked his foot in the loop on his rock, and his hand worked quickly, tearing the lobster loose, some singly and in cluster. He laid them in his bracket. In some place the oyster clung to one another so that they came free in lump. Now, Kino people had sung us everything that happened or existed. They had made song to the fish, to the sea in anger, and to the sea in calm, to the light and the dark, and the sun and the moon. And the songs were all in Kino and in his people, every song that had ever been made, even the one forgotten. And as he filled his basket, the song was in Kino, and the beat of the song was his pounding heart as in at the oxygen from his heart breath. And the melody of the song was the great green water and the little scattering animal and the cloud of flowers that flitted by and were gone. But in the song, there was a secret lyric in the song, hardly perceptible, but always there, sweet and secret and clinging, almost hiding in the counter melody. And this was the song of the peer that might be for every sad throw in the basket might contain a peer. Chance was again it, but luck and the god might be for it. And in the canon above him, Kino knew that Joanna was making the magic of prayer. Her face said Bridget and her master had to force the lock, to tear the lock out of the gold hand, for she needed a lock for swollen shoulder of Coyotito. And because the need was great and the desire was great, the little secret melody of the pill that might be was stronger this morning. Whole phrase of it came clearly and softly into the song of the undersea. Kino, in his pride and joy and strength, could remain down over 2 minutes without strain, so that he worked deliberately, selecting the larger cell because they were disturbed. The oyster cells were tightly closed. A little to his right, a hammock or roughly rock struck up, covered with young oyster not ready to take. Kino moved next to the hammock and then beside it, under a little overhang, he saw a very large oyster lying by itself, not covered with its clinging brother. The sail was partly open, for the overhang protects the eggs and oyster, and in the lip, like Marshal Kino saw a ghostly gleam, and then the shell closed down. His heart beat out a heavy rhythm, and the melody of the baby peal thrilled in his ear. Slowly he forced the oyster loose and held it tightly against his breast. He kicked his foot free from the rock group, and his body rose to the surface, and his black hair gleamed in the sunlight. He reached over the side of the canoe and laid the oyster in the bottom. The Joanna steadily the boat while he climbed in. His eye was shining with excitement, but in decency he pulled up this rock, and then he pulled up his basket of oyster and lifted them in. Joanna sent his excitement, and she pretended to look away. It is not good to want a thing too much. In some time, try the luck away. You might want it just enough, and you must be very tasteful with God or the gods. But you will not stop breathing very deliberately. Kino, when he shot strong light, he looked spectrally at the basket.
Perhaps it would be better to open the oyster last. He took a small oyster from the basket, cut the mussel, searched the folds of flesh, and threw it in the water. Then he seemed to see the great oyster for the first time. He squatted in the bottom of the canoe, picked up the shell, and examined it. The fluids were shining black to brown, and only a few small barnacles adhered to the shell. Now Kino was reluctant to open it. What he had seen, he knew, might be a reflection, a piece of flesh shell accidentally dripped in, or a complete illusion. In this gulf of uncertain light, there were more illusions than realities. But Juana's eyes were on him, and she could not wait. She put her hand on Coyotito's covered head. He opened it. She said softly, Kino deftly slipped his knife into the edge of the shell. Through the knife he could feel the muscle tighten hard. He worked the blade lever-wise, and the closing muscle parts, and the shell fell apart. The lip-like flesh reared up and then subsided. Kino lifted the flesh, and there it lay, the great pearl perfect as the moon. It captured the light and refined it, and gave it back in silver incandescence. It was as large as sea-gull egg. It was the greatest pearl in the world. Joanna caught her breath and moaned a little, and to Kino the secret melody of the maybe pearl broke clear and beautiful, rich and warm and lovely, glowing and gloating and irrepentant. In the surface of the great pearl he could see dream forms. He picked the pearl from the dying flesh and held it in his palm, and he turned it over and saw that its curve was perfect. Joanna came near to stare at icy in his hand, and it was the hand he had smashed against the doctor's gate, and the torn flesh of the knuckles was turned gleaming white by the sea water. Instinctively, Joanna went to Coyotito, where he lay on his father's blanket. She lifted the politic off a suit and looked at the shoulder. Kino, she cried cheerfully. He looked past his pearl and he saw that the swelling was going out of the baby's shoulder. The poison was receding from its body. Then Kino's fist closed over the pearl and his emotion broke over him. He put back his hand and hold. His eyes rolled up and he screamed and his body was rigid. The men in the other canoe looked up, startled, and then they dug their paddle into the sea and raced toward Kino's canoe. A town is a thing like a colonial animal. A town has a nervous system and a head and shoulders and feet. A town is a thing separate from all other towns, so that there are no two towns alike. A town has a whole emotion. How news travels through a town is a mystery not easily to be solved. News seems to move faster than small boys can scramble and dart to tell it, faster than women can call it over the fences. Before Kino and Joanna and the other Fishers had come to Kino's brush house, the nerves of the town were pulsing and vibrating with the news. Kino had found the pearl of the war. Before patent little boys could straggle out the words, their mothers knew it. The news swept on past and brush houses, and it washed in a foaming wave into the town of stone and plaster. It came to the priest walking in his garden, and it put a thoughtful look in his eyes, and a memory of certain repairs necessary to the church. He wondered what the pearl would be worth, and he wondered whether he had baptized Kino babies or married him for that matter. The news came to the shopkeeper, and they looked at men's clothes that had not sold so well. The news came to the doctor, where he sat with a woman whose illness was age, though neither she nor the doctor would admit it. And when it was made plain who Kino was, the doctor grew stern and judicious at the same time. He is a client of mine, the doctor said. I am treating his child for a scorpion sting, and the doctor's eyes rolled up a little in their fat hammocks, and he thought of Paris. He remembered the room he had lived in there as a great and luxurious place, and he remembered the hard-faced woman who had lived with him as a beautiful and kind girl. Although she had been none of these three, the doctor looked past his aged patient and saw himself sitting in a restaurant in Paris, and waiter was just opening a bottle of wine. The news came early to the beggars in front of the church, and it made them giggle a little with pleasure, for they knew that there is no almsgiver in the world like a poor man who is suddenly lucky. Kino had found the pearl of the war. In the town, in little offices, sat the men who bought pearls from the fishers. They waited in their chairs until the pearls came in, and then they cackled and fought and shouted and threatened until they reached the lowest price the fishermen would stand. But there was a price below which they dared not go, For it had happened that a fisherman in despair had given his pearls to the church, and when the buy was over, these buyers sat alone and their fingers played restlessly with the purse, and they wished they owned the purse for. There were not many buyers, really there was only one, and he kept these agents in separate offices to give a semblance of competition. The news came to these men, and their eyes squinted and their fingertips burned a little, and each one thought how the Baron could not live forever, someone had to take his place, and each one thought how with some capital he could get a new start. All manner of people grew interested in Kino, people with things to sell and people with favors to ask. Kino had found the pearl of the world. The essence of pearl mixed with essence of man, and curious dark residue was precipitated. Every man suddenly became related to Kino Pearl, and Kino Pearl went into the dreams, the speculations, the schemes, the plans, the futures, the wishes, the needs, the lust, the hungers of everyone. And only one person stood in the way, and that was Kino, so that he became curiously every man's enemy. The news stirred up something infinitely black and even in the town. The black distillate was like the scorpion, or like hunger in the smell of food, or like loneliness when love is with, and the poison cells of the town began to manufacture venom, and the town swelled and puffed with the pressure of it. But Kino and Juna did not know these things, because they were happy and excited. They thought everyone shared their joy. Juan, Tom, and Apollonian did, and they were the world too. In the afternoon, when the sun had gone over the mountains of the peninsula to seek in the outward sea, Kino squatted in his house with Joanna beside him, and the brush house was crowded with neighbors. Kino held the great pearl in his hand, and it was warm and alive in his hand, and the music of the pearl had merged with the music of the family, so that one beautiful the other. The neighbors looked at the pearl in Kino's hand, and they wondered how such luck could come to any man. And Juan Thomas, who squatted on Kino's right hand because he was his brother, asked, "What will you do now that you have become a rich man?" Kino looked into his pearl, and Juana cast her eyelashes down and arranged her shawl to cover her face so that her excitement could not be seen. And in the incandescence of the pearl, the pictures found all the things Kino might have considered in the past and had given up as possible. In the pearl, he saw Juana and Coyotito and himself standing and kneeling at the high altar, and they were being married now that they could pay. He spoke softly. "We will be married in the church." In the pearl he saw how they were dressed, Juana in a short sleeve with newness and a new skirt, and from under the long skirt Kino could see that she wore shoes. It was in the pearl. The picture glowing there. He himself was dressed in new white clothes, and he carried a new hat, not of straw, but of fine black felt, and he too wore shoes. Now, sandal bar shoes, that links. By Coyotito he was the one. He wore a blue sailor suit from the United States and a little yachting cap such as Kino had seen once when a pleasure boat pulled into the estuary. All of these things Kino saw in the lucent pearl, and he said, "We will have new clothes," and the music of the pearl rose like a chorus of trumpets in his ears. Then, to the lovely grey surface of the pearl came the little things Kino wanted: a harpoon to take the place of one lost a year ago, a new harpoon of iron with a ring in the end of the shaft, and his mind could hardly make the leap. A rifle, but why not, seeing he was so rich? And Kino saw Kino in the pearl, Kino holding a Winchester carbine. It was the wildest, daydreaming, and very pleasant. His lips moved hesitantly over this. A rifle, he said, perhaps a rifle. It was the rifle that broke down the barriers. This was an impossibility, and if he could think of having a rifle, whole horizon were burst, and he could rush on. For it is said that humans are never satisfied, that you give them one thing, and they want something more. And this is said in disparagement, whereas it is one of the greatest talents the species has, and one that has made it superior to animals that are satisfied with what they have. The neighbors, close pressed and silent in the house, nodded their heads at his wild imaginings, and a man in the rear murmured, "A rifle, he will have a rifle." But the music of the pearl was shrilling with triumph in Kino. Joanna looked up, and her eyes were wide at Kino's courage and at his imagination. An electric strata had come to him now. The horizon was clear out. In the pearl he saw Coyotito sitting at a little desk in a school, just as Kino had once seen it through an open door. And Coyotito was dressed in a jacket, and he had a white collar and a brown silken tie. Moreover, Coyotito was writing on a big piece of paper. Kino looked at his neighbors fiercely. "My son will go to school," he said, and the neighbors were hushed. Joanna caught her bright eyes uply, her were bright as she watched him, and he looked quickly down at Coyotito in her arms to see whether this might be possible. But Kino's face shone with prophecy. "Son, we might read and open the books, and my son, and we know writing, and my son will remember. He make, and these things will make us free. We, because know he will know the through Joanna him we, and in the pearl Kino saw himself, Coyotito, and then by a little fire in the brush we will read from a great book. This is what words do," said Kino, and he had never said of this together in his life. And suddenly he was talking. His hand closed down over the man's eyes, light away from it. Kino was afraid. "Who says, are we?" Without knowing a great now the neighbors knew. They had witnessed marvel. They knew that the moment for would now date no pearl, and that he would discuss this many years to come. If and once these things came to would record how and there Kino looked, and what how his eyes shone. Because and they would say, he transfigured nothing. Some power was given to him started. We see what a great man he has for a moment, and Amasa saw it. And if Kino plainly came to same, neighbor would say, there is started. Minus came over him so that his word God keep us from such things. Punish Kino because he rebelled against things are. You see what has become of Marcel saw the moment when his reason. Kino looked down at his closed hand, and the knuckles were scabbed over and tight where he had struck the gate. Now the dusk was coming, and Joanna looked her saw under the baby so that he hung against her hip, and she went to the fire hole and dug a coal from the ash, and broke a few twigs over it and fanned a flame alive. The little flames danced on the faces of the neighbors. They knew they should go to their own dinner, but they were reluctant to leave. The dark was almost in, and Joanna fired through shadows on the brush walls when the whisper came in passed from mouth to mouth. The father is coming. The prince is coming. The men uncovered their hands and stepped back from the door, and the women gathered their shawls about their faces and cast down their eyes. Kenor and Joanna Thomas, his brother, stood up. The priest came in, a graying Asian man with an old skin and a young sharp eye. Children, he considered these people, and he treated them like children. Keno, he said softly, thou art named after a great man, and the great father of the church. He made it sound like a benediction. Thine namesake tamed the deserts and sweetened the minds of thy people. Didst thou know that it is in the books? Keno looked quickly down, and Coyotito he had where he hung on Jonah's hips. Someday his mind said that that boy would know what things were in the books and what things were not. The music had gone out of Keno's hand, but now, thinly, slowly, a melody of the morning, the music of even of the enemy sounded. But it was faded and weak, and Keno looked at his neighbor to see who might have brought this song in. But the priest was speaking again. It has come to me that thou hast found a great fortune, a great pearl. Keno opened his hand and held it out, and the priest gasped a little at the size and beauty of the pearl. And then he said, I hope thou wilt remember to give thanks, my son, to him who has given these things treasure, and to pray for guidance in the future. Keno nodded doubly, and it was Joanna who spoke softly. We will, father, and we will be married now. Keno has said so. She looked at the neighbors for confirmation, and they nodded their heads solemnly. The priest said, It is pleasant to see that your first thoughts are good thoughts. God bless you, my children. He turned and left quietly, and the people let him through. But Keno's hand had closed tightly on the pearl again, and he was gazing about suspiciously, for the even song was in his ears, shrilly against the music of the pearl. The neighbors slipped away to go to their houses, and Joanna squatted by the fire and set her clay pot of boiled beans over the little flame. Keno stepped to the doorway and looked out. As always, he could smell the smoke from many fires, and he could see the hazy stars and feel the depth of the night air, so that he covered his nose from it. The thin dog came to him and thrashed itself in greeting like a wind-blown flag, and Keno looked down at it and didn't see it. He had broken through the horizon into a cold and lonely outside. He felt alone and unprotected, and scraped cricket and shrilling tree frogs and croaking toads seemed to be carrying the melody of even. Keno shivered a little and drew his blanket more tightly against his nose. He carried the pearl string in his hand, tightly closed in his palm, and it was warm and smooth against his skin. Behind him, he heard Joanna patting the cake before she put them down on the clay cooking sheet. Keno felt all the warmth and security of his family behind him, and the sound of the family came from behind him like a purring of a kitten. But now, by saying what his future was going to be like, he had created it. A plan is a real thing, and things projected are experienced. A plan once made and visualized becomes a reality along with other realities, never to be destroyed but easily to be attacked. Thus, Kano Future was really, but having set it up, other forces were set up to destroy it, and this he knew. So there, he had to prepare to meet the attack, and this Kano knew also that gods do not love man's plan, and the gods do not love success unless it comes by accident. He knew that the gods take their revenge on a man if he be successful through his own efforts. Consequently, Kano was afraid of plans per se, but having made one, he could never make it a hard skin for himself against the world. His eyes and his mind probed for danger before it appeared. Standing in the door, he saw two men approach, and one of them carried a ladder which lighted the ground and the legs of the man. They turned in through the opening of Kino's brush fence and came to his door, and Kino saw that one was the doctor and the other the servant who had opened the gate in the morning. The split knuckles on Kino's right hand burned when he saw who they were. The doctor said, "I was not in when you came this morning, but now, at the first chance, I have seen that baby." Kano stood in the door, feeling it and hated and flame in back of his eyes, and fear too, for dreads of years of subjugation were cupped in. "Come to, the baby is nearly well now," he said. "The doctor smiled, but his eye in their little fun hammocks did not smile. He said, 'Sometimes, my friends, the scorpion has a curious effect. There will be apparentment, and then without warning, puff, he slips and made a little explosion too, and so it could be, and he shifted his small black about so that the light of the lamp fell apart. Knew that Kino raised loved the tools of any trust them. Sometimes the doctor whether you in tow. Sometimes there will be a withered blind eye or crippled back. Oh, I know the scorpion, my friends, and I can cure it." Kino felt the rage and hated melting. He didn't know, and perhaps this doctor he could not take the chance of pitting his ignorance against his man possible. Knowledge was trapped as his people were always would be until, as he had said, they could be the thing in the books were really in the could not take a chance, not with the life or straightness or coyote. He stood aside. Doctor and his man entered the brush hut. Joanna stood up for the fire and beckoned. He entered, and she covered the baby face. Fring on her shawl, and when the doctor and held all his hands, she cluttered the baby. Look at Kino where he stood with the fire shadows leaping on his face. Kino nodded, and only then did she let the doctor take the baby. "Hold the light," the doctor said, and when the servant had the letter hiked, the doctor looked for a moment at the wood on the baby's shoulder. He was thoughtful for a moment, and then he rolled back the baby's eyelid and looked at the eyeball. He nodded his head while Coyotito struggled against him. "It is as I thought," he said. "The poison has gone in one and it will strike soon. Come look." He had the eyelid down. "See, it is blue," and Kino looking easily saw that, indeed, it was a little blue, and he didn't know whether or not it was always a little blue. But the trap was set. He couldn't take the chance. The doctor's eyes watered in their little hammocks. "I will give him something to try to turn the poison aside," he said, and he handed the baby to Kino. Then, from his bag, he took a little bottle of white powder and a capsule of gelatin. He filled the capsule with the powder and closed it, and then around the first capsule. He fitted a second capsule and closed it. Then he worked very deftly. He took the baby and pinched its lower lip until it opened its mouth. His fat figure placed the capsule far back on the baby's tongue, back of the pipe where he could spit it out, and then from the floor he picked up the little pitcher of perquid and gave Coyotito a drink. And it was done. He looked again at the baby's eyeball, and he pursed his lips and seemed to think. At last he handed the baby back to Joanna, and he turned to Kino. I think the poison will attack within the hour, he said. The medicine may save the baby from hurt, but I will come back in an hour. Perhaps I am in time to save him. He took a deep breath and went out of the hut, and his servant followed him with the letter. Now Joanna had the baby under her shawl, and she stared at it with anxiety and fear. Kino came to her, and he lifted the shawl and stared at the baby. He moved his hand to look under the eyelid, and only then saw that the pearl was still in his hand. Then he went to a box by the wall, and from it he brought a piece of rag. He wrapped the pearls in the rag, then went to the corner of the brush house and dug a little hole with his fingers in the dirt floors. And he put the pearl in the hole and covered it up and concealed the place. And then he went to the fire where Joanna was squatting, watching the baby faces. The doctor back in his house settled into his chair and looked at his watch. His people brought him a little soup of chocolate and sweet cakes and fruit, and he stared at the food disconsolately. In the house of the neighbor, the subject that would lead all conversation for a long time to come was air, for the first time to see how it would go. The neighbors showed one another with their thumbs how big the pearl was, and they made a little caressing gesture to show how lovely it was. From now to they would watch Kino and Joanna very closely to see whether Rich turned their hands as Richards turned all people's hands. Everyone knew why. The doctor had come. He was not good at disciplining, and he was very well understood. Out in the estuary, a tight-woven school of small fishes glittered and broke water to escape a school of great fishes that drove in to eat them. And in the house the people could hear the swish of the small ones and the bouncy splash of the great ones as the slaughter went on. The dampness arose out of the gulf and was deposited on bushes and cacti and on little trees in salty drops, and the night mice crept about on the ground, and the little night hawks heard them slyly. The skinny black puppy with flame spots over his eyes came to Kino's door and looked in. He nearly shook his headquarters loose when Kino glanced up at him, and he subsided when Kino looked away. The puppy did not enter the house, but he watched with frantic interest while Kino ate his beans from the little pottery dish and wiped it clean with a corn cake and ate the cake and washed the whole down with a drip of perquid. Kino was finished and was rolling a cigarette when Joanna spoke sharply. Kino! He glanced at her and then got up and went quickly to her, for he saw fright in her eyes. He stood over her, looking down, but the light was very dim. He kicked a pile of twigs into the fire hole to make a blaze, and then he could see the face of Coyotito. The baby's face was flushed, and his throat was working, and a little thick drool of saliva issued from his lips. The splash of the stomach muscle began and the baby was very sick. Kino knelt beside his wife, so the doctor knew. He said, but he said it for himself as well. As for his wife, for his mind was hard and suspicious, and he was remembered the white powder. Joanna rocked from side to side and moaned. All the little song of the family as thought it could warm off the danger, and the baby vomited and writhed in her arms. Now anxiety was in Kino, and the music of even dropped in his hand and nearly drove out Joanna's song. The doctor finished his chocolate and nibbled the little fallen pieces of sweet cake. He brushed his fingers on a napkin, looked at his watch, arose, and took up his little bag. The news of the baby's illness traveled quickly among the British houses, for sickness is second only to hunger as the enemy of poor people. And some said softly, "Look, you see, bring Peter, friends," and they nodded and got up to go to Kino House. The neighbors scattered with covered noses through the dark until they crowded into Kino House again. They stood and said that this should happen at a time of joy, and they said, "All things are in God's hands." The old woman squatted down beside Joanna to try to give her aid if they could and comfort if they could not. Then the doctor hurried in, followed by his men. He scattered the old woman like chickens. He took the baby and examined it, and felt its hand. "The poison it has worked," he said. "I think I can defeat it. I will try my best." He asked for water, and in the cup of it he put 3 drops of ammonia, and he pried open the baby's mouth and poured it down. The baby spluttered and screeched under the treatment, and Joanna watched him with hurted eyes. The doctor spoke a little as he walked. "It is lucky that I know about the poisons of the scorpion, otherwise," and he shrugged to show what could have happened. But Kino was suspicious, and he could not take his eyes from the doctor opening bag, and from the burden of white powder there. Gradually the spasms subsided, and the baby relaxed under the doctor's hands. And then Coyotito sighed deeply and went to sleep, for he was very tired with vomiting. The doctor put the baby in Joanna's arms. "He will get well now," he said. "I have won the fight." And Joanna looked at him with adoration. The doctor was closing his bag now. He said, "When do you think you can pay this bill?" He said it even kindly. "When I have sold my pearl, I will pay you," Kino said. "You have a pearl? A good pearl?" the doctor asked with interest. And then the chorus of the neighbors broke in. "He has found the pearl of the world," they cried, and they joined forefinger with them to show how great the pearl was. "Kino will be a rich man," they clamored. "It is a pearl such as one has never seen." The doctor looked surprised. "I had not heard of it. Do you keep this pearl in a safe place? Perhaps you would like me to put it in my safe." Kino's eyes were hooded now. His crease were drawn taut. "I have it secure," he said. "Tomorrow I will sell it, and then I will pay you." The doctor shrugged, and his wet eyes never left Kino's eyes. He knew the pearl would be buried in the house, and he thought Kino might look toward the place where it was buried. It would be a shame to have it stolen before you could sell it, the doctor said, and he saw Kino's eyes flick involuntarily to the floor near the side post of the brush house. When the doctor had gone, and all the neighbors had reluctantly returned to their houses, Kino squatted beside the little glowing coals in the fire hole and listened to the night sound, the soft sweep of the little waves and shore, and the distant barking of dogs, the creeping of the breeze through the brush house roof, and the soft speech of his neighbors in their houses in the village, for these people do not sleep soundly all night. They awake at intervals and talk a little and then go sleep again. And after a while, Kino got up and went to the door of his house. He smelled the breeze and he listened for any forest sound of secrecy or creeping, and his eyes searched the darkness for the music of even what sounded in his head, and he was fierce and afraid of. He he had probed a night with his sense. He went to a place by the side post where the pearl was buried, and he dug it up and brought it to his sleeping mat. And after his sleeping mat, he dug another little hole with the dirt floor and buried the pearl and covered up again. And Joanna, seated by the fire hole, watched him with questioning eyes, and when he had buried his pearl, asked, "Who do you fear?" Kino searched for a true answer, and at last he said, "Everyone," and he could feel a shell of hardness drawing over him. After a while, they lay down together on the sleeping mat, and Joanna did not put the baby in his tonight, but cradled him in her arms and covered.
But carried him in her arms, and covered his face with a head shawl, and the last night went out of the ember in the fire hole. But Kino's brain burned. Even during his sleep, and he dreamed that Kyoto could read, that one of his old people could tell him the truth of things. And in his dream, Kyoto was reading from a book as large as a house, with letters as big as dogs, and the words "Galap" and "Pray" on the book. And then darkness spread over the page, and with the darkness came the music of evil again. And Kino stirred in his dream, and when he stirred, Juana's eyes opened in the darkness, and then Kino awakened, with the evil music pulsing in him, and he lay in the darkness with his ear alert. Then from the corner of the house came a sound so soft that it might have been simply a start. I listened for a moment, a touch of a foot on the earth, the almost inaudible purr of controlled breathing. Kino held his breath in listen, and he knew that whatever dark thing was in his house was holding its breath too to listen. For a time, no sound at all came from the corner of the Batch house. Then Kino might have another thought. He had imagined the sound, but one hand came creeping over to him in warning, and then the sound came again, the whisper of the foot on dry earth and the scat of finger in the soil. And now a wild fear surged in Kino's breast, and on the fear came rage, as it always did. Kino's hand crept into his breast, where his knife hung on a string, and then he sprang like an angry crab. Leaves staggering and spitting from the dark thing he knew was in the corner of the house. He felt cold, struck at it with his knife and missed, and struck again, and felt his knife go through the coals, and then his head crashed with lightning and exploded with pain. There was a soft scurry in the doorway and running safe for a moment and then silent. Kino could feel warm blood running from his forehead, and he could hear Juana calling to him, "Kino! Kino!" And there was terror in her voice. Then coldness came over him as quickly as the ledge had, and he said, "I am all right. The thing has gone." He grooved his way back to the sleeping mat. Already Juana was working at the fire. She uncovered an ember from the ashes and shredded a little pieces of corn husk over it, and blew a little flame into the corn husk, so that a tiny light danced through the heart. And then, from the secret plate, Hona brought a little piece of consecrated candle, and lighted it at the flame, and set it upright on the fireplace stone. She worked quickly, crooning as she moved about. She dipped the end of her head shawl in water, and swabbed the blood from Kino's bruised forehead. "It is nothing," Kino said, but his eye and his voice were hard and cold, and the bloody head was growing in him. Now the tension which had been growing in Juana boiled up to the surface, and her lips were thin. "This thing is evil," she cried harshly. "This pearl is like a sin. It will destroy us," and her voice lowered sharply. "Throw it away, Kino. Let us break it between stones. Let us breathe and forget the plate. Let us throw it back into the sea. It has brought evil, Kino, my husband. It will destroy us." And in the firelight her hips and her eyes were alive with her fear. But Kino's face was set, and his mind and his will were set. "This is our one chance," he said. "Our son must go to school. He must break out of the pot that holds us. He must break out of the pot what holds us in. It will destroy us all," Juana cried. "Even our son." "Hush," said Kino. "Do not speak any more. In the morning we will sail the pole, and then the evil will be gone, and only the good remain. Now hush, my wife." His dark eye screwed into a little fire, and for the first time he knew that his knife was still in his hand, and he raised the blade and looked at it, and saw a little line of blood on the steel. For a moment he seemed about to wipe the blade on his trouser, but then he plunged the knife into the earth, and so cleansed it. The distant rooster began to crow, and the air changed, and the dawn was coming. The winds of the morning ruffled the water of the estuary, and whispered through the mangrove, and the little wave beat on the rubbery fleet. With the increased tempo, Kino raised the sleeping mat and dug up his pearl and put it in front of him and stared at it. And the beauty of the pearl, twinkling and glimmering in the light of the little candle, caused his brain with its beauty. So lovely it was, so soft, and its own music came over from it. Its music of promise and delight, its guarantee of the future, of comfort, of security, its warm, lucent promise, and protect against illness and the world agent insult. It closed the door of hunger, and as he stared at it, Kino's eyes softened, and his face relaxed. He could see the little image of the consecrated candle reflected in the soft surface of the pole, and he heard again in his ear the lovely music of the undersea, the tone of a diffused light of the sea bottle. Juana, glancing secretly at him, saw him smile, and because they were in some way one thing and one purpose, she smiled with him, and they began this day with hope. It is wonderful the way a little child keeps track of itself and of its unit. If every single man and woman, child and baby act and conduct itself in a no patrol, and break no vow and differ with no one, and experiment in no way, and is not sick and does not endanger the ease and the peace of mind or study and broken flow of the child, then the unit can disappear and never be heard of. But let one man step out of the regular thought of the known and trusted patrol, and the nerves of the town people ring with nervousness and communication travel over the nerve line of the town, then every unit communicates to the whole. That in La Paz, it was known in the early morning through the whole town that Kino was going to sell his pearl that day. It was known among the neighbors in the branch huts, among the pearl fishermen. It was known among the Chinese grocery store owners. It was known in the church, for the altar boy whispered about it. Word of it crept in among the nuns. The beggar in front of the church spoke of it for days. For they would be there to take the tithe of the first fruits of the lot. The little boy knew about it with excitement, but most of the pearl buyers knew about it. And when the day has come, in the office of the pearl buyer, this man sat alone with his little black velvet tray, and each man rolled the pearl about with his fingertips and considered his part in the picture. It was supposed that the pearl buyer was individual acting alone, beating against one another, for the pearl the fisherman bought then, and once it had been so. But this was a wasteful method, for often, in the excitement of bidding for a fine pearl, too great a price had been paid to the fisherman. This was extravagant and not to be countenanced. Now, there was only one pearl buyer with many hands, and the man who sat in their office and waited for Kino knew what price they would offer, how high they would bid, and what method each one would use. And although this man would not profit beyond their salary, there was excitement among the pearl buyer, for there was excitement in the hunt, and if it be a man's function to break down a price, then he must take joy and satisfaction in breaking it as far down as possible. For every man in the world functions to the best of his ability, and no one does less than his best. No matter what he may think about it, quite apart from any reward he might get, from any words of praise, from any promotion, and pearl buyer was a pearl buyer, and the best and happiest pearl buyer was he who bought for the lowest price. The sun was hot yellow that morning, and it drew the moisture from the estuary and from the grass and hung it in shimmering scraps in the air, so that the air vibrated and vision was insubstantial. A vision hung in the air to the North City, the vision of a mountain that was over 200 miles away, and the high slopes of this mountain were swathed with pines, and a great stone peak arose above the timberline. And the morning of this day, the canoe lay lined up on the beach. The fisherman did not go out to drive for pearl, for there would be too much happening, too many things to see when Kino went to sell the pearl. In the branch houses by the shore, Kino's neighbors sat long over their breakfast, and they spoke of what they would do if they had found the pole. And one man said that he would give it as a present to the Holy Father in Rome. Another one said that he would buy masses for the souls of his family for 1,000 years. Another thought he might take the money and distribute it among the poor of La Paz. And the fourth thought of all the good things one man could do with the money from the pearl, of all the charity benefits, of all the rescues one could perform if one had money. All of the neighbors hoped that sudden wealth would not turn Kino's head, would not make a rich man of him, would not graft onto him the devil limbs of greed and hatred and coldness. For Kino was a well-liked man. It would be a shame if the pole destroyed him. That's goodbye, Juana, they said, and the beautiful baby, Coyotito, and the other to come. What a pity it would be if the pole should destroy them all. The great pole was wrapped in the old soft piece of deerskin and placed in the little bag, and the little bag was in the pocket of Kino's shirt. He folded his basket carefully and dropped it in a narrow strip over his left shoulder, and now they were ready. Kino stepped with dignity out of the house, and Juana followed him, carrying Coyotito. And as they marched up the furnished washed alley towards the town, the neighbor joined them. The house burnt people, the doorways spilled out children, but because of the seriousness of this occasion, only one man walked with Kino, and that was his brother Juan Thomas. Juan Thomas cautioned his brother, "You must be careful to see they do not cheat you," he said, and very careful, Kino agreed. "We do not know what prices are paid in the other paid," said Juan Thomas. "How do we know what's a fair price if we do not know what the pole buyer get the pole in another paid?" "That is true," said Kino. "But how can we know? We are here, we are not there." And they walked up toward the city. The crowd grew behind them, and Juan Thomas, in the pale nervousness, went on speaking. "Before you were born, Kino," he said, "the old one thought of the way to get more money for the pole. They thought it would be better if they had an agent who took all the poles to the capital and sold them there and keep only his share of the profit." Kino knocked his head. "I know," he said. "It was a good thought." "And so they got just a man," said Juan Thomas, "and they pulled their pole and they started him off." And they started him off, and he was never heard of again, and the pole was lost. Then they got another man, and they started him off, and he was never heard again. And so they gave the whole thing up and went back to the old way. "I know," said Kino. "I have heard our father tell of it. It was a good idea, but it was ancient illusion." And the father made that very clear. The loss of the pearl was a punishment visited on those who tried to leave their station, and the father made it clear that each man and woman is like a soldier sent by God to guard some part of the castle of the universe, and some are in ramparts, and some far deep in the darkness of the war. but each one must remain faithful to his post and must not go running about, else the castle is in danger for the assault of hell. I have heard him make that sermon, said Juan Thomas. He makes it every year. The brothers, as they walked along, squinted their eyes a little, as they and their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers had done for 400 years. Since first the stranger came with argument and authority and gunpowder to back a board, and in the 400 years Kino's people had learned only one defense, a slight slitting of the eye and a slight tightening of the lip, as a retirement. Nothing could break the wall down, and they could remain whole within the wall. The gathering procession was solemn, for they sent the importance of this day, and any children who show a tendency to scuffle, to scream, to cry out, to steal hats and rumpled hair, were hit to silence by their elders. So important was this day that an old man came to see, riding on the stalwart shoulder of his nephew. The procession left the brush huts and entered the stroll, and passed the city where the streets were a little wider, and there were narrow pavements beside the buildings. And as before, the baker joined them as they passed the church. The grocers looked out at them as they went by. The little saloons lost their customer, and the owners closed up shop and went along, and the sun beat down on the street of the city, and even tiny stones threw shadow on the ground. The news of the approach of the procession ran ahead of it, and in their little dark office the pallbearer stiffened and grew alert. They got out papers so that they could be at work when Kino appeared, and they put their pearl in the desks. For it is not good to let an inferior pearl to seem beside a beauty, and word of the loveliness of Kino's pearl had come to them. The pallbearer office were clustered together in one narrow street, and they were barred at the windows, and wooden slats cut out the light so that only a soft gloom entered the office. A stout slow man sat in an office waiting. His face was fatherly and benign, and his eye twinkled with friendship. He was a caller of good morning and ceremonious shaking of hands, a jolly man who knew all jokes, and yet who never closed to sadness. For in the midst of a laugh, he could remember the death of your aunt, and his eye could become wet with sorrow of your loss. This morning he had placed a flower in a vase on his desk, a single scarlet hibiscus, and the vase sat beside the black velvet-lined pearl tray in front of him. He was shaved close to the blue root of his breast, and his hands were clean and his nails polished. His door stood open to the morning, and he hummed under his breath, while his right hand practiced legitimate. He rolled a coin back and forth forward his knuckles, and make it appear and disappear, make it spin and sparkle. The coin winked into sight and as quickly slipped out of the light, and the man did not even watch his own performance. The finger did it all mechanically, excitedly, while the man hummed to himself and peered at the door. Then he heard the thump of feet of the approaching crowd, and the finger of his right hand worked faster and faster until, at the figure of Kino through the doorway, the coin flashed and disappeared. "Good morning, my friend," the stout man said. "What can I do for you?" Kino stared into the dimness of the little office, for his eye was squat from the outside glass. But the buyer's eye had become as steady and cruel and unwinking as a hawk's eye, while the rest of his face smiled in greeting, and secretly, behind his desk, his right hand practiced with the coin. "I have a pole," said Kino, and Juan Thomas stood beside him, and snorted a little at the understatement. The neighbors peered around the doorway, and a line of little boys clambered on the window bars and looked through. Several little boys on their hands and knees watched the scene around Kino's legs. "You have a pearl?" the dealer said. "Sometimes a man brings in a dozen. Well, let us see your pearl. We will value it and give you the best price." And his finger worked furiously with the coin. Now, Kino instinctively knew his own dramatic effects. Slowly he brought out the leather bag, slowly took from it the soft and dirty piece of deer skin, and then he let the great pole roll into the black velvet tray, and instantly his eye went to the buyer's face, but there was no sign, no movement. The face did not change, but the secret hand behind the desk missed in the precision. The coin stumbled over a knuckle and slipped silently into the dealer's lap, and the fingers behind the desk curled into a fist. When the right hand came out of hiding, the forefinger touched the great pole, rolled it on the black velvet, thumb and forefinger picked it up, and brought it near to the dealer's eye and twirled into the air. Kino held his breath, and the neighbor held his breath, and there the whispering went back through the crowd. "He is inspecting it. No price has been mentioned yet, and there has not come to a price. Now the dealer's hand has become a personality." The hand tossed the great pole back in the tray, and the forefinger poked and insulted it, and on the dealer's face there came a sad and contemptuous eye. "I am sorry, my friend," he said, and his shoulder rose a little, indicate that the misfortune was no fault of his. "It's a pearl of great value," Kino said. The dealer finger spurned the pole, so that it bowed and rebounded softly from the side of the velvet tray. "You have heard a fool go," the dealer said. "This pearl is like a fool's gold. It's too large. Who would buy it? There is no market for such things. It is a curiosity only. I'm sorry you thought it was a thing of value, and it's only a curiosity." Now Kino's face was perplexed and worried. "It is the pearl of the world," he cried. "No one has ever seen such a pearl." "On the contrary," said the dealer, "it is large and clumsy. As a curiosity, it has interest. Some museum might perhaps take it to place in a collection of seashells. I can give you, say, 1,000 pesos." Kino's face grew dark and dangerous. It is worth 50,000, he said. You know it. You want to cheat me. And the dealer heard a little crumble go through the crowd, and they heard his price. And the dealer faced a little tremor of fear. Do not blame me, he said quickly. I am only an appraiser. Ask the other. Go to their office and show your pearl, or better, let them come here, so that you can see there is no collusion, boy, he called. And when his servant looked through the rear door, boy, go to shut a one, and shut another one, and shut a third one. Ask them to step in here, and do not tell them why. Just say that I will be pleased to see them. And his right hand went behind the desk and pulled another coin from his pocket, and the coins rolled back and forth forward knuckles. Kino's neighbors whispered together. They had been afraid of something like this. The pearl was large, but it had a strange color. They had been suspicious of it from the first, and after all, a 1,000 peso was not to be thrown away. It was comparative wealth to a man who was not wealthy. And suppose Kino took 1,000 peso. Only yesterday he had nothing. But Kino has grown tight and hard. He felt the creeping of dread and circling the wolves, the haver of vultures. He felt the evil coagulating about him, and he was helpless to protect himself. He heard in his ear the evil music, and once the black velvet, the great pole, glistened, so that the dealer could not keep his eye from it. The crowd in the doorway wavered, and broke, and let the 3 pole dealers through. The crowd was silent now, fearing to miss a word, to fail to see the gesture, or an expression. Kino was silent and watchful. He felt a little tugging at his back, and he turned and looked in Juana's eyes. And when he looked away, he had renewed strength. The dealer did not glance at one another nor at the pearl. The man behind the desk said, I have put a value of this pearl. The owner here does not think it fair. I will ask you to examine this thing and make an offer. Notice, he said to Kino, I have not mentioned what I have offered. The first dealer, dry and stringy, seemed now to see the pearl for the first time. He took it up, rolled it quickly between thumb and forefinger, and then cast it contemptuously back into the tray. Do not include me in the discussion, he said dryly. I will make no offer at all. I do not want it. It is not a pearl. It is a monstrosity. His thin lips curled. Now, the second dealer, a little man with a shy, soft voice, took up the pearl, and he examined it carefully. He took a glass from his pocket and inspected it under magnification. Then he laughed softly. Better pearls are made of plate, he said. I know the thing. It is soft and chalky. It will lose its color and die in a few months. Look. He offered the glass to Kino, show him how to use it. And Kino, who had never seen a pearl surface magnified, was shocked at the strange-looking surface. The third dealer took the pearl from Kino's hand. One of my clients likes such things, he said. I will offer 500 pesos, and perhaps I can sell it to my client for 600. Kino read quickly and snatched the pearl from his hand. He wrapped it into the deerskin and stuffed it inside his shirt. The man behind the desk said, "I'm a fool, I know, but my first offer stands. I still offer 1,000. What are you doing?" he asked, and Kino thought the pearl out of sight. "I am cheated," Kino cried fiercely. "My pearl is not for here. I will go, perhaps even to the capital." Now the dealer glanced quickly at one another. They knew they had prayed too hard. They knew they would be disciplined for their failure. And the man at the desk said quickly, "I might go for 1,500. But Kino was pushing his way through the crowd. The hum of talk came to him dimly. His red blood pounded in his ears, and he burst through and strode away. Juana followed, trotting after him. When the evening came, the neighbors in the bark houses sat eating their corn cakes and beans, and they discussed the great time of the morning. They did not know. It seemed a fine pole to them, but they had never seen such a pole before, and surely the dealers knew more about the value of pearl than they. And mark this, they say, those dealers did not discuss these things. Each of three knew the pearl was valueless. But suppose they had arranged it before. If that is so, then all of us has been cheated all of our lives. Perhaps some argued, perhaps it would have been better if Kino took the 1,500 peso. That is a great deal for money, more than he had ever seen. Maybe Kino is being a pig-headed fool. Suppose he should really go to the capital and find no buyer for his pearl. He would never live that down. And now, said other fearful ones, now that he had defied them, those buyers will not want to deal with him at all. Maybe Kino had cut off his own head and destroyed himself. And others said, Kino is a brave man and a fierce man. He is right. From his courage we may all profit. These were proud of Kino. In his house, Kino squatted on his sleeping mat, brooding. He had buried his pearl under a stone of the fire hole in his house, and he stared at the woven truth of his sleeping mat until the crust beside danced in his hand. He had lost one world and had not gained another. And Kino was afraid. Never in his life had he been far from home. He was afraid of strangers and of strange places. He was terrified of that monster of strangeness they called the capital. It lay over the water and through the mountains, over 1,000 miles, and every strange, terrible mile was frightening. But Kino had lost his own world, and he must clamber on the new one. For his dream of the future was real and never be destroyed. He had said, I will go, and that means a real thing too. To determine to go and to say it was halfway there. Juana watched him while he buried his pearls. And she watched him while she cleaned Coyote Toe and nursed him. And Juana made the corn cakes for supper. Juan Thomas came in and squatted down beside Kino and remained silent for a long time, until at last Kino demanded, "What else could I do? There are keys." Juan Thomas nodded gravely. He was the elder, and Kino looked into him for wisdom. "It's hard to know," he said. "We do know that we are cheated from birth to the overcharge on our coffins. But we survive. You have defied not the pearl buyers, but the whole structure, the whole way of life, and I am afraid of you." "What have I do to fear past vision?" Kino asked. But Juan Thomas shook his head slowly. "That we must all fear, but support your courage, support your pose is of great value. Do you think, then, the game is over?" "What do you mean?" "I don't know," said Juan Thomas, "but I am afraid for you. It is new ground you are walking on. You do not know the way." "I will go. I will go soon," said Kino. "Yes," Juan Thomas agreed. "That you must do, but I wonder if you will find it any different in the capital. Here you have friends and me, your brother. There you have no one." "What can I do?" Kino cried. "Some thief outraged it here. My sons must have a chance. That is what they are struggling at. My friend will protect me." "Only so long as they are not in danger or discomfort from it," said Juan Thomas. He arose and saying, "Go with God," and Kino said, "Go with God," and did not even look up, for the words had a strange chill to them.
Long after John Thomas had gone, Kino sat brooding on his sleeping mat. A lethargy had settled on him, and a little grey hopelessness. Every road seemed blocked against him. In his head he heard only the drug music of the enemy. His senses were burningly alive, but his mind went back to the deep participation with all the things, the gift he had from his people. He heard every little sound of gathering night, the sleepy complaint of setting birds, the love agony of cats, the strikes and the withdrawal of little waves on the beach, and the simple hiss of distance. And he could smell the sharp odor of exposed from the receding tide. The little flare of the twig fire made the design on his sleeping mat jump before his entranced eyes. Jonah watched him with worry, but she knew him, and she knew she could help him best by being silent and by being near. And as though she too could hear the song of Abel, she found it singing softly the melody of the family, of the safety and the warm wholeness of the family. She held Coyotito in her arms and sang the song to him to keep the evil out, and her voice was brave against the threat of the dark music. Kino did not move nor ask for his support. She knew he would ask when he wanted it. His eyes were entranced, and he could sense the very watchful evil outside the brush house. He could feel the dark creeping things waiting for him to go out into the night. It was shadow and dreadful, and yet it called to him and threatened him and challenged him. His right hand went into his shirt and felt his knife. His eyes were wide, and he stood up and walked to the doorway. Jonah willed to stop him. She raised her hand to stop him, and her mouth opened with terror. For a long moment Kino looked out into the darkness, and then he stepped outside. Jonah heard the little rush the grunting struggle, the blow. She froze with terror for a moment, and then her lips drew back from her teeth. She set Coyotito down on the ground. She seized a stone from the fireplace and rushed outside, but it was over by then. Kino was lying on the ground, struggling to reach, and there was no one near him. Only the shadows and the strife and the rush and the whips and the hiss of distance. But the evil was all about, hidden behind the brush fence, couched beside the house in the shadow. Juna dropped her stone and she put her arms around Kino and helped him to his feet and supported him into the house. Blood oozed down from the scalp, and there was a long deep cut in his cheek from ear to chin, a deep bleeding slash. And Kino was only half conscious. He shook his head from side to side. His shirt was torn open and his clothes half pulled off. Juna sat him down on his sleeping mat and she wiped the thickening blood from the face with her skirt. She bought him polking of drink in a little pitcher, and still he shook his head to clear out the darkness. Who? Jonah asked. I don't know, Kino said. I didn't see. Now the Jonah bought her clay spot of water and she washed the cut on his face while he strapped this ahead of him. Kino, my husband, she cried, on his eyes stared past her. Kino, can you hear me? I hear you, he said dully. Kino, this prayer is evil. Let us destroy it before it destroys us. Let us crush it between two stones. Let us throw it back in the sea where it belongs, Kino. It is evil, it is evil. And as she spoke, the light came back in Kino's eyes so that they glowed fiercely and his muscle hardened and his will hardened. No, he said, I will fight this thing. I will win over it. We will have our chance. His fist pounded the sleeping mat. No one shall take our good fortune from us, he said. His eyes softened, and then he raised a gentle hand on Jonah's shoulder. Believe me, he said, I am a man, and his face was crafty. In the morning we will take our canoe and we will go over the sea and over the mountain to the capital, and you and I, we will not be cheated. I am a man. Kino, I am afraid. A man can be killed. Let us throw the pearl back into the sea. Hush, he said fiercely. I am a man. And she was silent, for his voice was command. Let us sleep a little, he said. In the first light we will start. You are not afraid to go with me. No, my husband. His eyes were soft and warm on her then. His hand touched her cheek. Let us sleep a little, he said. The late moon arose before the fast roaster. Kino opened his eyes in the darkness, for he sensed a moment near him, but he did not move. Only his eyes searched the darkness, and in the pale light of the moon that crept through the holes in the bush house, Kino saw Jenner arise silently from beside him. He saw her move towards the fireplace. So carefully did she walk that she heard only the lightest sound when she moved the fireplace stone, and then, like a shadow, she glided towards the door. She paused for a moment beside the hanging box where Coyotito lay. Then, for a second, she was black in a doorway, and then she was gone. And the rag surged in Kino. He rolled up to his feet and followed her as silently as she had gone, and he could hear her quick footsteps going towards the shore. Quietly she tracked her, and his brain was red with anger. She brushed clear out the brush line and stumbled over the little boulders towards the water, and then she heard him coming and she broke into a run. Her arm was up to the throw when she leaped at her and caught her arm and wrenched April from her. He struck her in the face with a clenched fist, and she fell among the boulders, and he kicked her in the side. In the pale light, he could see a little waves break over her, and her skirt floated about the clung to her legs as the water receded. Kino looked down at her, and his teeth were bared. He hissed at her like a snake, and Juna stared at him with an unfrightened eyes. She knew there was a murder in him, and it was all right. She had accepted it, and she would not resist or even protest. And then the rag left him, and a sick disgust took its place. He turned away from her and walked up the beach and through the brush line. His senses were dulled by his emotion. He heard the rush, got his knife out and lunged at one dark figure and felt his knife go home, and then he was swept to his knees and swept again to the ground. Greedy fingers went through his clothes. Frantic figures searched him, and the Imperial knocked from his hand lay winking behind a little stone in the pathway. It gleamed in the soft moonlight. Jonah dragged herself up from the rock on the edge of the water. Her face was dull pain and her side ached. She steadied herself on the knees for a while, and her wet skirt clung on her. There was no anger in her for Kino. He had said, "I'm a man," and that meant certain things to Jonah. It meant he was half insane and half cold. It meant that Kino would drive his strength against a mountain and turn his strength against the sea. Jonah, in her woman's soul, knew that the mountain would stand while the man broke himself, and the sea would surge while a man drowned in it. And yet it was this thing that made him a man, half insane and half good. The Jonah had need a man. She could not live without a man, although she might be puzzled by a difference between man and a woman. She knew them and accepted them and needed them. Of course, she would follow him. There was no question of that. Sometimes the quality of a man, the reason, the caution, the sense of preservation could not, through Kino's manners, and save them all. She climbed painfully to her feet, and she dipped her cup palms in the light waves and washed her face with the stinging salt water, and then she went creeping up the beach after Kino. A flight of hurrying clouds and moved over the sky from the south. The pale moon dipped in and out of the string of clouds, so that Jonah walked in darkness for a moment and in light the next. Her back was bent with pain, and her head was low. She went through the line of brush when the moon was covered, and when it looked through, she saw the glimmer of great pearl in the path behind the rock. She sank to her knees and picked it up, and the moon went into the darkness of the clouds again. Jonah remained on her knees while she considered whether to go back to the sea and finish her job. And she considered. The light came again, and she saw two dark figures lying in the path ahead of her. She leaned forward and saw that one was Kino and the other a stranger with dark, shiny flute licking from his throat. Kino moves slightly, arms and legs straight like those of a crushed buck, and a thick muttering came from his mouth. Now, in an instant, Jonah knew that the old life was gone forever. A dead man in the path, and Kino's knife, dark-bladed, beside him, convinced her. All of the time, Jonah had been trying to rescue something of the old beast of the time before the period, but now it was gone, and there was no retrieving it. And knowing this, she abandoned the past instantly. There was nothing to do but to save themselves. Her pain was gone now. Her slowness quickly. She dragged the dead man from the pathway into the shelter of the brush. She went to Kino and sponged his face with her wet skirt. His senses were coming back, and she moaned. "They have taken the prill. I have lost it. Now it is over," he said. "The prill is gone." Juna quitted him as she would quite a sick child. "Hush," she said. "Here is your prill. I found it in the path. Can you hear me now? Here is your prill. Can you understand? You were killed a man. You must go away. They will come to us. Can you understand? We must be gone before the daylight comes." "I was attacked," Kino said uneasily. I struck to save my life." "Do you remember yesterday?" Jonah asked. "Do you think that will matter? Do you remember the man of the city? Do you think your explanation will help?" Kino drew a great breath and fought off his weakness. "No," he said. "You are right." And his will hardened, and he was a man again. Go to our house and bring Coyote," he said, "and bring all the corn he have. I will drag the canoe into the water, and we will go." He took his knife and left her. He stumbled towards the beach, and he came to his canoe. And when the light broke through again, he saw that a great hole had been knocked in the bottom, and a shearing rag came to him and gave him strength. Now the darkness was closing in on his family. Now the evil music filled the night, hung over the mangroves in the weed. The canoe of his grandfather, plastered over and over, had a splintered hole broken in it. This was an evil beyond thinking. The killing of a man was not so evil as the killing of a boat, for a boat does not have sons, and a boat cannot protect itself, and a wounded boat does not heal. There was a sorrow in Kino's rag, but this last thing had tightened him beyond breaking. He was an animal now, for hiding, for attacking, and he lived only to preserve himself and his family. He was not conscious of the pain in his head. He leaped up the beach through the brush line towards the brush house, and it did not occur to him to take one of the canoes of his neighbor. Never once did the thought enter his head, any more than he could convince breaking a boat. The roosters were crowing, and the dawn was not far off. Smoke of the first fires out through the wall of the brush house, and the first smell of cooking cakes was in the air. Already the dawn birds were singing in the bushes. The weak moon was losing its light, and the cloud thickened and curled to the southward. The wind blew freshly into the estuary, a nervous, restless wind with the smell of storm on his breath, and there was change and uneasiness in the air. Kino, hurrying towards his house, felt a surge of exhilaration. Now he was not confused, for there was only one thing to do. The Kino's hand went first to the great frill in his shirt, and then to his knife hanging under his shirt. He saw a little glow ahead of him, and then, without interval, a tall flame leaped into the dark with a cracking roar, and a tall of fire lighted the pathway. Kino broke into a run. It was his brush house, he knew, and he knew that this house could burn down in a very few moments. And as he ran, a shouting figure ran towards him, Juna with Coyotito in her arms and Kino's shoulder blanket clutched in her hand. The baby moaned with fright, and Jonah's eyes were weak and terrified. Kino could see the house was gone, and he did not question Jonah. He knew, but he said it was thrown up and the floor dug. Even the baby's box thrown out, and as I looked, they put the fire to the outside. The fierce light on the burning house lighted Kino's face strongly. "Who?" he demanded. "I don't know," she said. "The dark ones, the neighbors were trembling from the house now, and they watched the falling sparks and stamped them out to save their own houses." Suddenly Kino was afraid. The light made him afraid. He remembered the man lying dead in the brush beside the path, and he took Joanna by the arm and drew her into the shadow of a house away from the light. From light was danger to him. For a moment he considered, and then he walked among the shadows until he came to the house of John Thomas, his brother, and he slipped into the doorway and drew Jonah after him. Outside he could hear the squall of children and the shout of the neighbors, for his friends thought he might be inside the burning house. The house of John Thomas was almost exactly like Akino's house. Nearly all the bush houses were alike, and all leaked light and air, so the Jonah and Kino, sitting in the corner of the brother house, could see the leaping flames through the wall. They saw the flames tall and furious. They saw the roof fall and watched the fire die down as quickly as twig fire dies. They heard the cries of warning of their friends and the shrill, keening cry of Apollonia, wife of Jonah Thomas. She, being the nearest woman relative, raised a formal lament for the death of family. Apollonia realized that she was wearing her second best head shawl, and she rushed to her house to get her fine new one. As a rummage in a box by the wall, Kino's voice said quietly, "Apollonia, do not cry out. We are not hurt." "How do you come here?" she asked. "Do not question," he said. "Go now to John Thomas and bring him here, and tell no one else. This is important to us, Apollonia." She passed her hand helpless in front of her, and then, "Yes, my brother-in-law," she said. In a few moments John Thomas came back with her. He lighted a candle and came to them where they crouched in a corner and said, "Apollonia, see to the door and do not let anyone enter." He was older, John Thomas, and he assumed the authority. "Now, my brother," he said. "I was attacked in the dark," said Kino, "and in the fight I have killed a man." "Who?" asked John Thomas quickly. I do not know. It was all darkness and shape of darkness." "It is the peril," said John Thomas. "There is a devil in this peril. You should have sold it and passed on the devil. Perhaps you can still sell it and buy peace for yourself." And Kino said, "Oh, my brother, an insult has been put on me that is deeper than my life. For on the beach my canoe is broken, my house is burned, and in the brush a dead man lies. Every escape is cut off. You must hide us, my brother." And Kino, looking closely, saw deep worry come into his brother's eyes and forestalled him in possible refusal. "Not for long," he said quickly, "only until a day has passed and the new night has come. Then we will go." "I will hide you," said John Thomas. I do not want to bring danger to you," Kino said. "I know I am like a leprosy. I will go tonight and then you will be safe." "I will protect you," said John Thomas, and he coughed. Apollonia closed up the door. "Do not even whisper that Kino is here." They sat silently all day in the darkness of the house, and they could not hear the neighbors speaking to them. Through the walls of the house they could watch their neighbors raking through the ashes to find the bones crouching in the house of John Thomas. They heard the shock go into the neighbor's mind at the news of the broken boat. John Thomas went out among the neighbors to deliver his suspicions, and he gave them theories and ideas of what had happened to Kino and Jonah and to the baby. To one he said, "I think they had gone south along the coast to escape the evil that was on them." And to another, "Kino would never leave the sea. Perhaps he found another boat." And he said, "Apollonia is ill with grief." And in that way the wind rose up to beat the gulf and tore the gulf and whipped the line the shore. And the wind cried through the brush house, and on board was safe on the water. The John Thomas told among the neighbors, "Kino is gone. If he went to the sea, he is drowned by now." And after each trip among the neighbors, John Thomas came back with something borrowed. He brought a little woven straw bag, the red beans, and a ground full of rice. He borrowed a cup of dried peppers and a block of salt, and he bought in a long working knife, 18 inches long and heavy, as small as a tool and a weapon. And when Kino saw his knife, his eyes lighted up, and he found the blade, and his thumb tasted the edge. The wind screamed over the gulf and turned the water white, and mangroves pulled the frightened cattle, and a fine sandy ducks arose from the land and hung in satisfying still over the sea. The wind drove off the cloud and skinned the sky clean and dripped the sand of the country like snow. The John Thomas, when the evening approached, talked along with his brother. "Where will you go?" "To the north," said Kino. "I have heard that there are cities in the north." "Avoid the shore," said John Thomas. They are making a party to search the shore. The man in the city will look for you." "Do you still have the pearl?" "I have it," said Kino, "and I will keep it. I might have given it as a gift, but now it is my misfortune and my life, and I will keep it." His eyes were hard and cruel and bitter. Coyote whispered, and Jonah muttered little magic over him to make him silent. "The wind is good," said John Thomas. "There will be no attack." They left quietly in the dark before the moon had risen. The family stood formally in the house of John Thomas. Jonah carried Coyote on her back, covered and held in by her shawl, and the baby slept turned sideways against the shoulder. The heat shawl covered the baby, and no ends of it came across Joanna's nose to protect her from the evil night air. John Thomas embraced his brother with a double embrace and kissed on both cheeks. "Go with the God," and he said. It was like a day. "You will not give up the prayer. This prayer has become my soul," said Kino. If I give it up, I shall lose my soul. Go thou with the God." The wind was fierce and strong, and it filled them with bits of stick, sand, and little rocks. Jonah and Kino gathered their clothing tighter about them and covered their nose and went out into the world. The sky was brushed clean by the wind, and the stars were cold in the black sky. The two walked carefully, and they avoided the center of the town where some sleeper in a doorway might see them pass, for the town was closed itself in against the night, and anyone who moved about in the darkness would be noticeable. Kino threaded his way around the edge of the city and turned north by the stars, and found the rooted sandy road that led through the brushy country towards Loreto, where the miraculous Virgin has her station. Kino could feel the blown sand against his ankles, and where he was glad, for he knew there would be no tracks. The little light from the stars made out of him a narrow road through the brushy country, and Kino could hear the pat of Jonah's feet behind him. He went quickly and quietly, and Jonah trotted behind him to keep up. Some ancient things stared in Kino through his fear of dark and the devils that haunt the night. There came a rush of exhilaration. Some animal thing was moving in him so that he was cautious and very dangerous. Some ancient thing out of the past of his people was alive in him. The wind was at his back, and the star guided him. The wind cried and whisked in the breast, and the family went on monotonously, hour after hour. They passed no one and saw no one. At last, to their right, the waning moon arose, and when it came up with the wind died down, and the land was still. Now they could see the little road ahead of him, deep cut with sand drifted wheel tracks. With the wind gone, there would be footprints, but they were a good distance from the town, and perhaps their track might not be noticed. Kino walked carefully in the wheel route, and Jonah followed in his path. One big cart going to the town in the morning could wipe out every trace of the passage. All night they walked and never changed their pace. Once Coyote awakened, and Jonah shifted him in front of her and soothed him until he went to sleep again, and the evils of the night were about them. The coyotes cried and laughed in the brush, and the owls screeched and hissed over the heaths, and once some large animal lumbered away, crackling the undergrowth as it went, and Kino gripped the handle of the big working knife and took a sense of protection from it. The music of the prayer was trumpet in Kino's head, and then quite a melody of the family underlay it, and they wove themselves into the soft padding of sandal feet in the dark. All night they walked, and in first dawn Kino searched the roadside of a covert to lie in during the day. He found his place near to the road, a little clearing where deer might have lain, and it was certain thickly with the dry little trees that lined the road. And when Jonah had seated herself and had settled to nurse the baby, Kino went back to the road. He broke a branch and carefully swept the footprints where they had turned from the roadway, and then in the first light he heard the crack of a wagon, and he crouched beside the road and watched a heavy two-wheeled cart go by, drawn by crouching oxen. And when it had passed out of sight, he went back to the roadway and looked at the nut and found that the footprints were gone. And again he swept out his trays and went back to Jonah. She gave him the soft corn cakes Alvonia had packed for them, and after a while she slept a little, but Kino sat on the ground and stared at the earth in front of him. He watched the ants moving, a little column of them near to his foot, and he put his foot in their path. Then the column climbed over his instead in their path. Then the column climbed over his instead and continued on its way. And Kino left his foot there and watched them move over it. The sun arose hotly. They were not near the gulf now, and the air was dry and hot, so that the brush crackled with heat, and a good resinous smell came from it. And when Juno awakened, when the sun was high, Kino told her things she knew already. Be aware of that kind of tree, dear, he said, pointing. Do not touch it, for if you would do, and then touch your eyes, it will blind you. And be aware of that tree that bleeds. See that one over there, for if you break it, the red blood will flow from it, and it is evil luck. And she nodded and smiled a little to him, for she knew this thing. Will they follow us? She asked. Do you know they will try to find us? They will try, said Kino. Whoever finds us will take the prayer. Who they will try. The Jonah said, perhaps the dealers were right, and the prayer has no value. Perhaps this has all been an illusion. Kino reached into his clothes and brought out the prayer. He let the sun play on it until it burned in his eyes. No, he said, they would not have tried to steal it if it had been valueless. Do you know who attacked you? Was it the dealers? I don't know, he said. I didn't see them. He looked into his prayer to find his vision. When we sell it at last, I will have a rifle, he said, and he looked into shining surface for his rifle, but he saw only a huddled dark body on the ground with shiny blood dripping from its throat. And he said quickly, we will be married in a great church. And in the prayer he saw Jonah with her beaten face calling home through the night. Our son must learn to read, he said frantically, and there in a prayer was Coyote's face, thick and feverish from the medicine. The Kino thrust the prayer back into clothing, and the music of the prayer had become sinister in his ears, and it was interwoven with the music of evil. The hot sun beat on the earth, so that Kino and Jonah moved into the lacy shade of the brush, and the small grey birds scampered on the ground in the shade. In the heat of the day, Kino realized and covered his eyes with his head and wrapped his blanket about his face to keep the flies off, and he slept. But Jonah did not sleep. He sat quiet at a stone, and her face was quiet. Her mouth was still swollen where Kino had struck her, and big flies buzzed around the cut on her chin. But she sat as still as a sentinel, and when Coyote awakened, she placed him on the ground in front of her and watched him wave his arm and kick his feet. and he smiled and growled at her until she smiled too. She picked up a little twig from the ground and trickled him, and she gave him water from the ground she carried in the bundle. Kino stared in a dream. Kino in his dream, he cried out in a guttural voice, and his hands moved in symbolic fighting, and then he moaned and sat up. Suddenly his eyes wide and his nostrils flaring. He listened and heard only the creaking heat and the hiss of a distance. "What is it?" Jonah asked. "Hush," he said. "You were dreaming, perhaps." But he was restless, and when she gave him a corn cake from her store, he paused in his chewing to listen. He was uneasy and nervous. He glanced over his shoulder. He lifted the big knife and felt its edge. When Coyote rolled on the ground, Kino said, "Keep him quiet." "What is the matter?" Jonah asked. "I don't know." He listened again, an animal light in his eyes. He stood up then, silently, and crouched low. He threaded his way through the bush towards the road, but he did not step into the road. He crept into the cover of a thorny tree and peered out along the way he had come.
About on the little beach, and they saw Kino's progress up the cliff before they drank. The man with the rifle sat down and rested himself, and the trackers squatted near him. And in the evening, the point of their cigarette glowed and receded. And then Kino could see that they were eating, and the soft murmur of their voices came to him. Then darkness fell, deep and black, in the mountain cleft. The animals that used the pool came near and smelled man there, and drifted away again into the darkness. He heard a murmur behind him. Jonah was whispering, "Kayatito." She was begging him to be quiet. Kino heard the baby whimper, and he knew from the muffled sounds that Jonah had covered his head with her shawl. Down on the beach, a match flared, and in its momentary light, Kino saw that two of the men were sleeping, curled up like dogs, while the third watched, and he saw the glint of the rifle in the match light. And then the match died, but it left a picture on Kino's eyes. He could see it, just how each man was, two sleeping curled up, and the third squatting in the sand with the rifle between his knees. Kino moved silently back into the cave. Joanna's eyes were two sparks reflecting a low star. Kino crawled quietly close to her, and he put his lips near to her cheek. "There is a way," he said, "but they'll kill you." "If I get first to the one with the rifle," Kino said, "I must get to him first. Then I'll be all right." Two are sleeping. Her hand crept out from under her shawl and gripped his arms. "They'll see your white clothes in the starlight." "No," he said, "and I must go before moonrise." He searched for a soft word and then gave it up. "If they kill me," he said, "lie quietly, and when they are gone away, go to Loreto." Her hand shook a little, holding his waist. "There is no choice," he said. "It is the only way. They will find us in the morning." Her voice trembled a little. "Go with God," she said. He peered closely at her, and he could see her large eyes. His hand fumbled out and found the baby, and for a moment his palm lay on Kayatito's head. And then Kino raised his hand and touched Joanna's cheek, and she held her breath. Against the sky in the cave entrance, Joanna could see that Kino was taking off his white clothes, for dirty and ragged, though they were they would show up against the dark night. His own brown skin was a better protection for him. And then she saw how he hooked his amulet neck string about the horn handle of his great knife so that it hung down in front of him and left both hands free. He did not come back to her. For a moment, his body was black in the cave entrance, crouched and silent, and then he was gone. Joanna moved to the entrance and looked out. She peered like an owl from the hole in the mountain, and the baby slept under the blanket on her back, his face turned sideways against her neck and shoulder. She could feel his warm breath against her skin, and Joanna whispered a combination of prayer and magic, her Hail Marys, and her ancient intercession against the black, unhuman thing. The night seemed a little less dark when she looked out, and to the east there was a lightning in the sky, down near the horizon where the moon would show. And looking down, she could see the silhouette of the man on watch. Kino edged like a slow lizard down the smooth rock shoulder. He had turned his neck string so that the great knife hung down from his back and could not clash against the stone. His spread fingers gripped the mountain, and his bare toes found support to contract, and even his chest lay against the stone so that he would not slip. For any sound, a rolling pebble or a sigh, a little slip of flesh on rock would rouse the watchers below. Any sound that was not germane to the night would make them alert. But the night was not silent. The little tree frogs that lived near the stream tweeted like birds, and the high metallic ringing of the cicadas filled the mountain cleft, and Kino's own music was in his head, the music of the enemy, low and pulse, nearly asleep. But the song of the family had become as fierce and sharp and feline as the snarl of a female puma. The family song was alive now and driving him down on the dark enemy. The harsh cicada seemed to take up its melody, and the tweeting tree frogs called little phrases of it. And Kino crept silently as a shadow down the smooth mountain face. On bare foot, moved a few inches, and the toes touched the stone and creaked. And the other foot, a few inches, and then the palm of one hand a little downward, and then the other hand, until the whole body, without seeming to move, had moved. Kino's mouth was open so that even his breath would make no sound, for he knew that he was not invisible. If the watcher, sensing movement, looked at the dark place against the stone, which was his body, he could see him. Kino must move so slowly that he would not draw the watcher's eyes. It took him a long time to reach the bottom and to crouch behind a little drop palm. His heart thundered in his chest, and his hands and face were wet with sweat. He crouched and took great, slow, long breaths to calm himself. Only 20 feet separated him from the enemy now, and he tried to remember the ground between. Was there any stone which might trip him in his rush? He kneaded his legs against cramp and found that his muscles were jerking after their long tension. And then he looked apprehensively to the east. The moon would rise in a few moments now, and he must attack before it rose. He could see the outline of the watcher, but the sleeping men were below his vision. It was the watcher Kino must find quickly and without hesitation. Silently he drew the amulet string over his shoulder and loosened the loop from the horn handle of his great knife. He was too late, for as he rose from his crouch, the silver edge of the moon slipped above the eastern horizon, and Kino sank back behind his bush. It was an old and ragged moon, but it threw hard light and hard shadow into the mountain cleft. And now Kino could see the seated figure of the watcher on the little beach beside the pool. The watcher gazed full at the moon, and then he lighted another cigarette, and the match illuminated his dark face for a moment. There could be no waiting now. When the watcher turned his head, Kino must leap. His legs were as tight as a wounded spring. And then from above came a little murmuring cry. The watcher turned his head to listen, and then stood up. And one of the sleepers stared on the ground and awakened and asked quietly, "What is it?" "I don't know," said the watcher. It sounded like a cry, almost like a human, like a baby. The man who had been sleeping said, "You can't tell. Some coyote pitched with a litter. I've heard a coyote pup cry like a baby." The sweat rolled in drops down Kino's forehead and fell into his eyes and burned them. The little cry came again, and the watcher looked up the side of the hill to dark cave. "Coyote maybe," he said. And Kino heard the harsh click as he cocked the rifle. "If it's a coyote, this will stop it," the watcher said as he raised the gun. Kino was in a mid-leap when the gun crashed and the barrel flash made a picture on his eyes. The great knife sunk and crouched hollowly. It bit through neck and deep into chest, and Kino was a terrible machine now. He grasped the rifle even as he wrenched free his knife. His strength and his movement and his speed were a machine. He whirled and struck the head of the seated man like a melon. The third man scrabbled away like a crab, slipped into the pool, and then he began to climb frantically, to climb up the cliff where the water penciled down. His hands and feet thrashed in the tangle of the wild grapevine, and he whimpered and quivered as he tripped to get up. But Kino had become as cold and deadly as steel. Deliberately he threw the lever of the rifle, and then he raised the gun and aimed deliberately and fired. He saw his enemy tumble backward into the pool, and Kino strode to the water. In the moonlight he could see the frantic, frightened eyes, and Kino aimed and fired between the eyes. And then Kino stood uncertainly. Something was wrong. Some signal was trying to get through his brain. Tree frogs and cicadas were silent now. And then Kino's brain cleared from its red concentration, and he knew the sound. The keening, moaning, rising hysterical cry from the little cave in the side of the stone mountain. The cry of death. Everyone in La Paz remembers the return of the family. There may be some old ones who saw it, but those whose fathers and whose grandfathers told it to them remember it nevertheless. It is an event that happened to everyone. It was late in the golden afternoon when the first little boys ran hysterically in the town and spread the word that Kino and Joanna were coming back, and everyone hurried to see them. The sun was settling toward the western mountains, and the shadows on the ground were long, and perhaps that was what left the deep impression on those who saw them. The two came from the rutted country road into the city, and they were not walking in single file, Kino ahead and Joanna behind as usual, but side by side. The sun was behind them, and their long shadows stalked ahead, and they seemed to carry two towers of darkness with them. Kino had a rifle across his arm, and Joanna carried her shawl like a sack over her shoulder, and in it was a small limp, heavy bundle. The shawl was crusted with dried blood, and the bundle swayed a little as she walked. Her face was hard and lined and leathery with fatigue, and with the tightness with which she fought fatigue, and her wide eyes stared inward on herself. She was as remote and as removed as heaven. Kino's lips were thin and his jaws tight, and the people say that he carried fear with him, that he was as dangerous as a rising storm. The people say that the two seemed to be removed from human experience, that they had gone through pain and had come out on the other side, that there was almost a magical protection about them. And those people who had rushed to see them crowded back and let them pass and did not speak to them. Kino and Joanna walked through the city as though it were not there. Their eyes glanced neither right nor left, nor up nor down, but stared only straight ahead. Their legs moved a little jerkily, like well-made wooden rolls, and they carried pillars of black fear about them. And as they walked through the stone and plaster city, brokers peered at them from barred windows, and servants put one eye to the slated gate, and mothers turned the faces of the youngest children inward against their skirts. Kino and Jonah stood side by side through the stone and plaster city and down among the bruised houses, and the neighbors stood back and let them pass. John Thomas raised his hand in greeting and did not say the greeting, and left his hand in the air for a moment uncertainly. In Kino's ears, the song of the family was as fierce as a cry. He was immune and terrible, and his song had become a battle cry. They trudged past the burned square where their house had been without even looking at it. They cleared the brush that edged the beach and picked their way down the shore toward the water. And they did not look toward Kino's broken canoe. And when they came to the water's edge, they stopped and stared out over the gulf. And then Kino laid the rifle down, and he dug among his clothes. And then he held the great pearl in his hand. He looked into its surface, and it was grey and ulcerous. Evil faces peered from it into his eyes, and he saw the light of burning. And in the surface of the pearl, he saw the frantic eyes of the man in the pool. And in the surface of the pearl, he saw Kayatito lying in the little cave with the top of his head shot away. And the pearl was ugly. It was grey, like a malignant growth. And Kino heard the music of the pearl, distorted and insane. Kino's hand shook a little, and he turned slowly to Jonah and held the pearl out to her. She stood beside him, still holding her dead bundle over her shoulder. She looked at the pearl in his hand for a moment, and then she looked into Kino's eyes and said softly, "No, you." And Kino drew back his arm and flung the pearl with all his might. Kino and Jonah watched it go, winking and glimmering under the setting sun. They saw the little splash in the distance, and they stood side by side, watching the place for a long time. And the pearl settled into the lovely green water and dropped toward the bottom. The waving branches of the algae called to it and beckoned to it. The lights on the surface were green and lovely. It settled down to the sand bottom among the fern like plants. Above, the surface of the water was a green mirror, and the pearl lay on the floor of the sea. A crab scampering over the bottom raised a little cloud of sand, and when it settled, the pearl was gone, and the music of the pearl drifted to a whisper and disappeared. And then he saw them moving along. His body stiffened, and he drew down his head and peeked out from under a fallen branch. In the distance, he could see 3 figures, 2 on foot and 1 on horseback. But he knew what they were, and a chill of fear went through him. Even in the distance, he could see the 2 on foot moving slowly along, bent low to the ground. Here, one would pause and look at the earth, while the other joined him. They were the trackers. They could follow the trail of bighorn sheep in the stone mountains. They were as sensitive as hounds. Here, he and Jonah might have stepped out of the wild rut, and these people from the inland, these hunters, could follow, could read the broken straw or a little tumbled pile of dust. Behind them, on a horse, was a dark man, his nose covered with a blanket, and across his saddle a rifle gleamed in the sun. Kino lay as rigid as the tree limb. He barely breathed, and his eyes went to the place where he had swept out the track. Even the sweeping might be a message to the trackers. He knew these inland hunters. In a country where there was little game, they managed to live because of their ability to hunt, and they were hunting him. They scuttled over the ground like animals and found a sign and crouched over it while the horsemen waited. The trackers whined a little, like excited dogs on a warming tail. Kino slowly drew his big knife to his hand and made it ready. He knew what he must do. If the trackers found the sweet place, he must leap for the horseman, kill him quickly, and take the rifle. That was his only chance in the world. And as the three drew nearer on the road, Kino dug little pits with his sandal toes so that he could leap without warning, so that his feet would not slip. He had only a little vision under the fallen limb. Now Joanna, back in her hidden place, heard the pat of the horse hoofs, and Kayatito gurgled. She took him up quickly and put him under her shawl and gave him her breast, and he was silent. When the trackers came near, Kino could see only their legs, and only the legs of the horse from under the fallen branch. He saw the dark horny feet of the men and their ragged white clothes. He heard the crack of leather of the saddle and the clink of spurs. The trackers stopped at the sweet place and studied it, and the horseman stopped. The horse flung his head up against the bit, and the bit roller clicked under his tongue, and the horse snorted. Then the dark trackers turned and studied the horse and watched his ears. Kino was not breathing, but his back arched a little, and the muscles of his arms and legs stood out with tension, and the line of sweat formed on his upper lip. For a long moment, the trackers bent over the road, and then they moved on slowly, studying the ground ahead of them, and the horsemen moved after them. The trackers scuttled along, stopping, looking, and hurrying on. They would be back, Kino knew. They would be circling and searching, peeping, stooping, and they would come back sooner or later to his covered track. He slid backward and did not bother to cover his tracks. He could not. Too many little signs were there, too many broken twigs and scuffed places and displaced stones. And there was a panic in Kino now, a panic of flight. The trackers would find his trail. He knew it. There was no escape, except in flight. He edged away from the road and went quickly and silently to the hidden place where Joanna was. She looked up at him in question. "Trackers," he said, "come." And then a helplessness and hopelessness swept over him, and his face went black and his eyes were sad. "Perhaps I should let them take me." Instantly, Joanna was on her feet and her hand lay on his arms. "You have the bird," she cried hoarsely. "Do you think they would take you back alive to say they had stolen it?" His hand stayed limply to the place where the pearl was hidden under his clothes. "They will find it," he said weakly. "Come," she said, "come." And when he did not respond, "Do you think they would let me live? Do you think they would let the little one here live?" Her groaning stuck into his brain, his lips snarled, and his eyes were fierce again. "Come," he said, "we will go into the mountains. Maybe we can lose them in the mountain. Frantically, he gathered the gourd and the little bags that were their property. Kino carried a bundle in his left hand, but the big knife swung freely in his right hand. He parted the bush for Jonah, and they hurried to the west, toward the high stone mountains. They trotted quickly through the tangle of the undergrowth. This was panic flight. Kino did not try to conceal his passage as he trotted, kicking the stones, knocking the telltale leaves from the little trees. The high sun streamed down on the dry, creaking earth so that even the vegetation ticked in protest. But ahead were the naked granite mountains, rising out of erosion nibble and standing monolithic against the sky. And Kino ran for the high place, as nearly all animals do when they are pursued. This land was waterless, filled with the cacti which could store water, and with the great rooted brush which could reach deep in the earth for a little moisture and get along on very little. And underfoot was not soil but broken rock, split into small cubes, great slabs, but none of it water around it. Little tufts of dry grass grew between the stones, grass that had sprouted with one single rain and hid it, dropped its seed, and died. Horn trod watched the family go by and turn the little pivoting dragon head. And now and then a great jackrabbit, disturbed in his shade, bumped away and hid him behind the nearest rock. The singing heat lay over his desert country, and ahead the stone mountains looked cool and welcoming. And Kino fled. He knew what would happen. A little way along the road, the trackers would become aware that they had missed the path, and they would come back, searching and judging, and in a little while they would find the place where Kino and Jonah had rested. From there it would be easy for them. These little stones, the fallen leaves, and the weed branches, the scuffed places where a foot had slipped, Kino could see them in his mind, slipping along the track, winning a little with eagerness, and behind them, dark and half disinterested, the horseman with the rifle. His work would come last, for he would not take them back. Oh, the music of evil sang loud in Kino's head now. It sang with the whine of heat and with the dry ringing of snake rattles. It was not large and overwhelming now, but secret and poisonous, and the pounding of his heart gave it undertone and rhythm. The wave began to rise, and as it did, the rocks grew larger. But now Kino had put a little distance between his family and the trackers. Now, on the first rise, he rested. He climbed a great boulder and looked back over the shimmering country, but he could not see his enemies, not even the tall horseman riding through the bush. Jonah had squatted in the shade of the boulder. She raised her bottle of water to Kayatito's lips. His little dry tongue sucked greedily at it. She looked up at Kino when he came back. She saw him examine her ankles, cut and scratched from the stones and bush, and she covered them quickly with her skirt. Then she handed the bottle to him, but he shook his head. Her eyes were bright in her tired face. Kino moistened his cracked lips with his tongue. "Jonah," he said, "I'll go on and you will hide. I will lead them into the mountains, and when they have gone past, you will go north to Loreto or to Santa Rosalia. Then, if I can escape them, I will come to you. It is the only safe way." She looked full into his eyes for a moment. "No," she said. "We go with you." "I can go faster alone," he said harshly. "You will put the little one in more danger if you go with me." "No," Jonah said. "You must. It is the wise thing and it is my wish, he said. No, said Joanna. He looked then for weakness in her face, for fear or irresolution, and there was none. Her eyes were very bright. He shrugged his shoulders helplessly then, but he had taken strength from her. When they moved on, it was no longer panic flight. The country, as it rose towards the mountains, changed rapidly. Now there were long outcroppings of granite with deep crevices between, and Kino walked on bare, unmarkable stone when he could and lived from ledge to ledge. He knew that wherever the trackers lost his path, they must circle and lose time before they found it again. And so he did not go straight for the mountains anymore. He moved in zigzags, and sometimes he got back to the south and left a sign, and then went toward the mountains over bare stone again. And the path rose steeply now, so that he painted a little as he went. The sun moved downward toward the bare stone teeth of the mountains, and Kino set a direction for a dark and shadowy cleft in the range. If there were any water at all, it would be there where he could see, even in the distance, a hint of foliage. And if there were any passes through the smooth stone range, it would be by his same deep cleft. It had its danger, for the trackers would think of it too, but the empty water bottle did not let that consideration enter. And as the sun lowered, Kino and Joanna struggled wearily up the steep slope toward the cleft. High in the grey stone mountains, under a frowning peak, a little spring bubbled out of a rupture in the stone. It was fed by shade-preserved snow in the summer, and now and then it died completely, and bare rocks and dry algae were on its bottom. But nearly always it gushed out, cold and clean and lovely. In the times when the quick rain fell, it might become a freshet and send its column of white water crashing down the mountain cleft, but nearly always it was a lean little spring. It bubbled out into a pool and then fell 100 feet to another pool, and this one, overflowing, dropped again, so that it continued down and down until it came to the rubble of the upland, and there it disappeared altogether. There wasn't much left of it then anyway, for every time it fell over an escarpment, the thirsty air drank it, and it splashed from the pools to the dry vegetation. The animals from miles around came to drink from the little pools, and the wild sheep and the deer, the pumas and raccoons, and the mice all came to drink. And the birds, which spent the day in the brushland, came at night to the little pools that were like steps in the mountain cleft. Beside this tiny stream, wherever enough earth collected for roothold, colonies of plants grew, wild grape and little palms, maidenhair ferns, hibiscus, and tall pampas grass with feathery rods raised above the spike leaves. And in the pool lived frogs and water scatters, and the water worms crawled on the bottom of the pool. Everything that loved water came to these few shallow places. The cats took their prey there, and strewed feathers and lapped water through their bloody teeth. The little pools were places of life because of the water, and places of killing because of the water too. The lowest step, where the stream collected before it tumbled down 100 feet and disappeared into the rubbly desert, was a little platform of stone and sand. Only a pencil of water fell into the pool, but it was enough to keep the pool full and to keep the ferns green in the underhang of the cliff. And wild grape climbed the stone mountains, and all manner of little plants found comfort here. The freshets had made a small sandy beach through which the pool flowed, and the bright green watercress grew in the damp sand. The beach was cut and scarred and padded by the feet of animals that had come to drink and to hunt. The sun had passed over the stone mountains when Kino and Joanna struggled up the steep broken slope and came at last to the water. From this step they could look out over the sun-beaten desert to the blue gulf in the distance. They came utterly weary to the pool, and Joanna slumped to her knees and first washed Kayatito's face and then filled her bottle and gave him a drink. And the baby was weary and petulant, and he cried softly until Joanna gave him her breast, and then he gurgled and clucked against her. Kino drank long and thirstily at the pool for a moment. Then he stretched out beside the water and relaxed all his muscles and watched Joanna feeding the baby. And then he got to his feet and went to the edge of the step where the water slipped over, and he searched the distance carefully. His eyes set on the point, and he became rigid. Far down the slope he could see the two trackers. They were little more than dots or scurrying ants, and behind them a larger ant. Joanna had turned to look at him, and she saw his back stiffened. "How far?" she asked quietly. "They will be here by evening," said Keen. He looked up the long steep chimney of the cleft where the water came down. "We must go west," he said, and his eyes searched the stone shoulder behind the cleft. And 30 feet up on the grey shoulder he saw a series of little erosion caves. He slipped off his sandals and clambered up to them, gripping the bare stone with his toes, and he looked into the shallow caves. They were only a few feet deep, wind-hollowed scoops, but they sloped slightly downward and back. Kino crawled into the largest one and lay down and knew that he could not be seen from the outside. Quickly he went back to Jonah. "You must go up there. Perhaps they will not find us there," he said. Without a question, she filled her water bottle to the top, and then Kino helped her up to the shallow cave and brought up the packages of food and passed them to her. And Jonah sat in the cave entrance and watched him. She saw that he did not try to erase the tracks in the sand. Instead, he climbed up the brush cliff beside the water, clawing and tearing at the ferns and wild grape as he went. And when he had climbed 100 feet to the next bench, he came down again. He looked carefully at the smooth rock shoulder toward the cave to see that there was no trace of passage. And last he climbed up and crept into the cave beside Jonah. "When they go up," he said, "we'll slip away, down to the lowlands again. I'm afraid only that the baby may cry. You must see that he does not cry." "He will not cry," she said. And she raised the baby's face to her own and looked into his eyes and stared solemnly back at her. "He knows," said Jonah. Now Kino lay in the cave entrance, his chin braced on his crossed arms, and he watched the blue shadow of the mountains move out across the brushy desert below until it reached the gulf and the long twilight of the shadow was over the land.